Okay, are we right to go? Everything right up there? Okay, good, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to announce that I've had some feedback about the live feed and that apparently it looks very good on screen. So if you want to be a movie star, today you might want to stand up and do a performance of some descriptor. So that's good. There'll be a good record of this event, which is already more than fulfilling my expectations, and I don't think today will be any different. But I want to say something about yesterday, just by way of overview. When I started the exercise this morning, I thought, how does one summarise what was said yesterday in 5 minutes? The answer is you don't, and you can't, and so I think where I got to in my thinking is that all I want to do is remind you of some of the highlights, or perhaps the things that stood out for me. That might be the best I can do. But obviously, so if I don't mention a lot of things that you thought were important, and speakers will forgive me for not dealing in detail with what they had to say yesterday, especially Ken, because there's so much material, it's impossible to do it justice by trying to summarise it into a few minutes. But I just want to indicate how I saw yesterday the significant bits for me. The whole focus on listening, what Hugh Mackay had to say about it being a gift and about it being hard work, and how listening shows respect and means that you're taking people seriously. And of course, Hensey's book, which was where my interest in this was tweaked when I saw that on a shelf in a bookstore in the early 90s, Why Don't People Listen? I immediately bought it. The telling thing was that I didn't read it for 10 years, but I'd owned it since 1992. And then when I rang you to tell him that I thought the book was fantastic, he said, well, I'm in the process of putting out an e-book version of it. So you can't buy that book in hard copy now, but you'll see out there's reference to it, and it can be acquired on eBay, by e-book purchase through whatever, Amazon or whatever. And that's only a very recent edition, so he's revisited the topic and updated it. And that's available, and it's a fantastic book. It's easy to read, and it's very helpful. Then we did the exercise, which is something we talked about and then we hadn't actually put in the program. I'm very pleased we did. And the exercise, I think, was salutary for everybody. 5 minutes seems like forever. Now, who would ever think you'd say that? When you get to your feet to speak, 5 minutes goes in a second. And yet when you're sitting trying to listen to someone like for 5 minutes, it's more like 4 hours. And it's difficult. Shows how hard it is, and it shows its value. Get an opportunity to develop a deeper emotional statement, as Yvonne said yesterday, and I think Anna said. And it also shows the habits we have, that you've got to break, the tendency to want to talk, the tendency to want to ask questions, that you need to be aware of your habits and know how to keep them in check. And Joan did a wonderful debrief on it, for which I thank her. That was very nice of her, because I gave her about 2 seconds notice. Ken then talked about the barriers to listening, the injection myth, about trust. I thought it was telling that he said, well, one of the reasons that people won't listen to you is because they don't trust that you'll ever listen to them. I thought that had some potency in all the things he said about the barriers. And then, of course, he came to the cage, which has some controversy about it. I still like it as an analogy. One can get too caught up with it. But I like the image, the idea of the barriers to communication being reflected in that tangible image. And Ken and I had a conversation about it later, which was quite telling, about jail bars in Mexico being only an inch apart, so that if people come to visit, they can only stick their finger through and touch fingers, which I found astonishing. And then he talked about triggers to listening, triggers that interfere with listening, key words that people don't like to hear, and they shut down. It's like putting a cover over the cage, saying, I'm not going to engage, I don't like that topic, I don't want to talk about that. When I was a kid, and it probably still is, my mother used to say, you never talk about sex, politics, or religion. I thought, that actually shortens the conversation up a bit. I hope parents are still not. I'm sorry? That's all we talk about, says Joan. And then we got to the point of loving and caring, and at some moment during the morning, John Lizio has been talking to us this morning. He's a very old friend of mine, and the first person who ever introduced me to leadership effectiveness training in the 80s. And John has some things to say about love and caring. That was touched on, and very important theme from yesterday about no matter whether you like people or not, you want to be able to talk to everybody and show them respect. Ken then took up the cudgels of Yu's work in this area of the art of communication and conversation, as it were, and took that into the world of conflict, about the need for effective communication in conflict, and again emphasised that listening was critical. And it made this point that I thought was very significant for me, the idea of asking yourself, what do these words mean in this context? Because they might have a dictionary meaning, but the question is, in the particular context, they can mean something entirely different. They might even mean the opposite to what the words actually used mean in terms of a dictionary sense. And I thought the example of glad to see you, it was a simple one but a good one about how many different ways you can say that expression and carry so many different meanings. And that's why tone, listening closely to people's tone, and every aspect of the non-verbal communication, where's the emphasis? And then, of course, what Ken was talking about in Hugh Mackay's terms, Ken was then developing what are the barriers that are in play to effective communication in conflict. And in one sense, taking the analogy of the cage again, what are the cages of these people look like? What are their barriers to communication, and how do we break them down? And again, the emphasis on the non-verbal. I thought the question about how much of it is non-verbal, between 50 and 90%, was a suggestion of what the non-verbal aspects of communication. So don't get fixated on the words, there's a lot more going on. And of course it underscores the importance of face-to-face and the need to protect face-to-face dialogue, because you're going to lose a lot if you spend your time on the internet talking or emailing. My sister Carol said something very funny last night, which is unusual. Can you tell the audience, it's not unusual, I should have said. Tell them what you read on Facebook yesterday or the day before. Could you just read it out? I thought this is the funniest thing I'd heard in a while.
It's simple. I just want to make sure you're doing it right. I'm having a few people over to stare at their phones later if you'd like to come by.
Yeah, on Saturday I'm having some people over to stare at their phones. Would you like to come by? I thought, wow, I wish I'd have had that yesterday. Then Ken talked about the structure of conflict conversations, which was fascinating to me. And I must say that the simplicity but the power in this idea of you are lazy, and the idea of the accusation starting so many conflicts, and how useless it is, that it leads to defence, denial, and or counter-allegation, and things get bad from there. And I've already told the story to some of you here and overnight about it. The idea of when you hear someone say something like that, to say, well, if someone says to another person, you are lazy, that idea is, well, what I'm really saying about me is that I feel like I'm carrying too much of the load. And if you have that thought, then rather than fire the accusation, say what you mean, which is, can we talk about the distribution of work, because I'm not feeling all that comfortable about it. That doesn't escalate into a conflict. It's then a conversation about the subject matter, and it's from the heart. I thought that was fascinating, and I'll take that to my grave, I'm sure. Ken talks about it, lack of communication training from the cradle to the grave. Fortunately, you've done a lot to help ensure that that doesn't happen. And then, of course, the pronouns. We had a discussion last night about the importance of that pronoun material, not using you, they, he or she did certain things, but crossing it through to the I, the we, and the it, which will move to the subject matter of the conversation rather than the accusation. Ken mentioned the 3 methods of resolving conflict by reference to power, rights, and interests. I thought that was very important. I thought the air conditioning example is something that you might remember about how you might resolve a conflict, because it was cold in here yesterday. I was on this side of the room, I can tell you, at least initially. But the idea of how that could have been resolved, I thought, was a salutary lesson. He then moved on to the narrative structure of conflict stories and dealt with the issue of myths. And I think we'll all carry away the idea that we're all princesses. That was a very helpful lesson, as far as I can see, about how we approach conflict and how we all want the sympathy, and so we tailor the stories to demonise others and play victim for ourselves, and how that's got to be addressed. If you want to have an effective communication and an honest, authentic and vulnerable communication, those propositions have got to be broken down, and you've got to get back to a proper conversation. The point is that we avoid direct emotional communications, as Ken said. I thought the issue of dishes in the sink was another telling story from yesterday. It's never, so many disputes are not about what they seem to be. The dishes in the sink is a perfect example of that. It's not really an indication of the problem at all. It's a way of avoiding an emotional conversation about the true issue is, do you respect me? Do you love me in that context? And the idea of needing to preserve your own self-image, not want to show that you have real emotional concerns about anything. I thought the stepping stones example was terrific about directing his wife, a guy directing his wife to stand on certain stones to get across the river, and saying that and Ken said, well, why did you feel that you had to do that? He said, well, if she fell in, and I didn't, it'd be my fault. I thought that was a very instructive example about where conflict comes from when there's no need for it at all. And the idea of nothing can be done, I thought that was very helpful. That a lot of the conflict stories you hear, they really are statements, then there is nothing possible that can be done about this, nothing I can do to fix it, it is just one of those things. And that, once you hear that, you know that there's work to be done, and work that can be done. So Ken then talked about the issue of synthesizing those stories that you hear, the various accounts, to take out the victim and take the princess out of it, take the villain out of it. And the upshot was that the prince says, ultimately, I'm not going to solve it, you've got to take your own course. The princess has to take some responsibility for the cause of the problem, and the villain has to be shown some empathy. I thought that's a very useful triangulation situation that was a good example. And then we had a lot of talk about the power of acknowledgement, and there's going to be more of that this morning. When Joan comes to the podium, a lot more talk about acknowledgement and the power and the need for it. It seems to be, I think, will ultimately be a variant on the themes that I wrote up a long time ago. This comes right to the fore as a central proposition. The flowers story was moving enough about giving each other's flowers in the hospital, and the add-on to that, the recognition, the joint recognition with the bell, or the sounds that would have been made when a child died, and the sounds that would have been made when a child was released having recovered, was a very potent story, because it highlighted that the underlying anxiety was one that they all shared, is that they were working hard in a very difficult environment, and yet it had turned into conflict when it didn't have to if people just spoke up about what was really ailing them, which was, this is a tough gig, and if we pull together, we'll feel better. And then, of course, the teachers' stories, I think it did bring a couple of us to tears. That idea of somebody, the power of acknowledgement in the context of thanks, the same as the flower story, only it had more potency about it, because there was so much anger about it that had been denied. The denial of matters through anger, and then the realization that that's just covering up some deep-seated and genuine emotional concern. So after that, as we said at lunchtime, or if that had been stretched out for the whole of the day, it would have been a wonderful day at the office. But we moved on because I'd loaded the program so heavily with my desire to have so much canvassed. We then dealt with the disputes at work. We looked at causes: poor communication, avoidance of conflict, disrespect, the McGregor theory. How do you feel about people? How do organisations treat their people? Do they treat them with respect, or they regard them as a liability? We talked about structures and the hierarchy. I thought Ken's work about hierarchy and the messages, if you've got a pyramid, the difficulty it is from getting messages from the top down to where it should come from, and how people on the shop floor, where there's more people, how they ever get their messages heard. I thought that was a very potent image, and hence Ken talked a lot about flattening the hierarchy. And I thought the other point in that context that was potent, the question came up about where's the power to resolve disputes at work, and the answer was at the top. But where's the problem? It's at the bottom. So the solutions to the people who have the power to resolve disputes need to be much closer to where the problem is, and not distant and lose touch with what's going on. He talked about culture, the need for feedback in the context of performance review, and interestingly enough, and Joan had talked about this, the need for mediators and coaches within workplaces. And indeed, that is where we really want to head. We need people who have the training in all organisations and settings. Conflict dispute systems, you might call these places, everywhere is one, to help with the difficult issues. As people skill up, they get more and more skill. And that really is now seen to be, and I think rightly so, as part of the promise of mediation, or the promise of mediation skills. Mike Roddy in the last session confirmed the power of face-to-face conversations and the difficulty with the technological age, if you're not careful, that it can swamp effective communication. Grant Donovan highlighted that there is an evidentiary base for this. The best performing companies in the world behave exactly this way, that they treat their people well, they treat them with respect, they listen to them, they value them, and of course when you do that you need less rules and less focus on rights. I thought that Grant's example about the young boy chipping onto a green, it helped me, and I think this will be a yardstick for remembering what Hugh Mackay had said and Ken had emphasised. Listening and the whole question of effective communication is very difficult, and that's why we often usually don't do it. But I thought the image of somebody chipping away from off the green onto the green can then be applied as a metaphor here, i.e. keep chipping away. If you keep chipping away at being an effective communicator and being a good listener, then you will succeed. And John Lizio said the very thing this morning. This is a long-term project and you need renewal. And then we heard from Anna Booth about the workplace relations, or this wasn't sequential, but we heard about the encouraging developments of interest-based bargaining and in that context and education. And similarly so, Gillian Triggs then helped with her comments about the Australian Human Rights Commission. And it's heartening news that she gave us about the success rate they're having in getting apologies and genuine respect for the resolution of a lot of difficult workplace issues, amongst a lot of other things she said. That's how I saw yesterday, and I've left out a lot, but hopefully they'll be reminders for the power of what we heard yesterday and help you to remember it better. There's nothing more I need to say, and probably said too much. I now invite Joanna Kolowski to come up, and Stephen O'Ryan and John McDonald, and we'll move into session 5, which is going to be led by Joanna, focusing more, as I suggested, on the centrality of acknowledgement and her amazing experience. Can I say this? I adopted a practice, having consulted with the team, that I wasn't going to go through a formal introductory page with everybody, a formal introduction. I regret that a little bit now, and I apologise to those that have already been through, because I think in one sense it's not really respectful enough to just say, here are some very prominent people and rely upon the speaker's statement on the table. But nevertheless, I've started with that, and so I'm not going to disrespect the people further by long introductions. So, but I commend what we've said in the speaker's outline. Everybody's profile is there, and these are very impressive people who you should listen to very closely. Thanks, Joe.
I think am I on deck? And could we have light? I promise not to show any slides. So I think you should be in the light and not in the darkness. This is a session that should bring light. The 2 days should bring light. I need to start because Henry Kissinger was mentioned yesterday, and it is my very best Henry Kissinger story. Unfortunately, it's not true. A young man from Ireland was offered the opportunity, no, I'll change that. It was a young woman from Ireland was offered the opportunity to mediate the dispute between Protestants and Catholics. And she very reluctantly but modestly took the task on, but with one condition, and that was that before she took this on, she wanted to go and speak to the master mediator himself. She wanted to talk to Henry Kissinger. It was duly arranged. Now, by this time, Mr. Kissinger was well and truly retired, and he was living on a beautiful estate in upstate New York. And first she was flown there, and then she was driven down this very, very long avenue of trees, having gone through his Golden Gates. And all the way down through this massive park, she could hear the sound of the jungle, and she wondered what that was. But the mystery was solved as at the moment she arrived, she saw the great man himself standing on his front porch, ready to welcome her, but at his feet, a huge golden enclosure in which there was a lion and a lamb. And she was totally blown away. And she said to him, "Mr. Kissinger, now I understand what it is you do." And he said, "Sure you do. I replace the lamb every day." We can do better than that. I think it was Joan Goldsmith who yesterday took us to what I think of as the political and social dimensions of this. This is not light-hearted stuff. This is not deal-making. This is getting people to live in a society without a freewheeling sense of grievance, as the judge in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, of which I was a member for 10 years, used to say. She used to say to us as members, when people walk in here, they're a citizen with a freewheeling sense of grievance. What are you going to do about it? She said, what you are going to do about it is send them out of here feeling that that grievance has been lifted from their shoulder, whether they won or not. And I used to think, the woman's mad. People have only got their grievance resolved if they win the case. And she turned out to be right. And we need to examine why. And in particular, I'd like to refer with Stephen O'Ryan here, former Justice Stephen O'Ryan of the Federal Court, the Family Court of Australia, to a most extraordinary program that he was involved. He was the leader in introducing to the Family Court and that I had the privilege of being involved in. So what I'd like to start with, besides my Henry Kissinger story, is something that I learnt by working in the area of trauma. And I've written this as a paper, but I'm only going to read you a tiny slice, and these are not my words, these are the words of Judith Herman, who's a great researcher in this area. And she says, we need to understand some of the tenets of trauma, which is now an established science, the treatment of trauma. She says, 1, remembering and truth-telling, truth and storytelling are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and for healing individuals. The conflict between the will to deny painful events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central paradox of the psychological trauma. Recognition, can we call it acknowledgement? Recognition allows survivors to begin the recovery. And while secrecy and denial prevail, the traumatic event surfaces not as a narrative, but as a symptom. Think of what Ken and Joan said yesterday about not difficult people, but what I called in a workshop I've just run in Italy called what makes people difficult. What we have to understand is not difficult people, but what makes them difficult. They are difficult for us, and very often it's because their difficulty, their silence, is emerging as a symptom, not as a story. And we're dealing with people who are, in the Australian vernacular, behaving like two Bob watches, Joan and Ken. Recovery, says Judith Herman, is based on empowerment of the harmed person and restoring connections between them and their community. Think of the workplace. And the harmed person must be the author of his or her own recovery. So I'm going to range over a number of things that I hope bring together what came up in my mind when so many of you were speaking yesterday, both audience and presenters. And that is, there's something that I always say because I work in the cross-cultural arena. And that first thing is something that I'd like you to remember if you fall asleep right now. And that is that you don't know who's in the room. And it's your task to find out, which means it's your task to engage with them with genuine curiosity and wonder. And I think if you do that, you'll discover that the things that you anticipated about this person are absent, and some of the unanticipated things are present. So you don't know who's in the room. The next thing is, when we talk about acknowledgement, and I've had a little word this morning with John Lizio, who I hope will take a moment later on and drop his customary modesty and say something to us about the work that he's been doing in both leadership and parent effectiveness development. It is that who are we speaking to when we are acknowledging someone? And if I can go to the example that Stephen O'Ryan will talk about in a moment, it is that it is very easy to talk to the person in front of you and only see the superficial stuff. So in the family court, one of the things that was noticed by the judges, and I was following the judges around, that was my excellent job, and creating a model out of what they were discovering in a thing called the less adversarial trials process, which Stephen will tell you all about. We discovered that if the judge had formally said, I'd like now to hear from the father, usually looking at the lawyer, what you got was anger, or I'd like to talk to the mother. And people would say, look, settle down, madam, or, you know, you'll get your chance, or whatever it was. And why was that? Because we were speaking to that person in the one arena at which, at this moment, they were denied. But when the judges started to say, Mrs. Brown, I'd really like to hear from you, and right after that, from you, Mr. Brown, everything changed. Because we heard yesterday that in conflict, people narrow. They narrow down to their focus on the grievance, what went wrong, as Ken said yesterday, what was done to me and by whom. That's the conflict story. But when we remind people that they are citizen, woodchopper, neighbour, tennis player, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, whatever they are, when we remind them of all the things they are, we acknowledge their full humanity. And we are speaking not to the angry father, but to Mr. Brown, who is more than an angry father. So it's, I think, quite important to do something that I've called in the work that I do, saliences. And everybody, all my colleagues yell at me because they don't know what I mean. But when you're an old Latin teacher, this dies very hard. What I mean is what is salient in us at any one moment, what is uppermost. And yesterday, when Hugh made his understandable plea for women to be patient with men, what was uppermost in me was the woman. And I felt a feeling of discomfiture because I feel that we women have been giving men a very good go for about 1 million years, and in the last 40 years there's been quite a lot of resentment that we're not doing it quite so much anymore. I think it's related to the wave of domestic violence. Because I think in the public sphere, it's very hard to get a bunch of fives if you stand up to someone, but it's not so hard in the private sphere. And I say that because I've worked in that arena as well. So, I'm not standing here now as a woman, but I was sitting there yesterday as a woman when I heard that. So some of what we hear will prime us for one part of ourselves to be uppermost. If you make a racist joke, then the bit of me that is very active in the area of anti-racism will be uppermost, and I will speak. If that subject doesn't come up, I may not even think about it. So that if I was to say who I am standing here now, I'm not mediator. If we listed all the things I am, I'm woman, mother, grandmother, wife, sister, citizen, bird watcher. I know you're all fascinated by that. Gardener. You know, nobody's going to seek me out at morning tea and ask me what bird I most recently saw. I know this for a fact. But if anybody wants to talk about bird watching, I promise it will go straight to the top of my head. So we have to ask ourselves when we're acknowledging people, who are we speaking to? Which person am I speaking to in the person in front of me? And certainly when I did some work at State Rail Authority, where nearly all the cleaners were Muslim women, one of the managers at that place, which was in tremendous dispute, said to me, well, you know, what can you expect? You know, she's a downtrodden Muslim woman. And I found myself saying, you know, interesting, Doug, that you should say that. I even remember his name. Isn't that funny how it comes back after all these years? I said, all you see is the hijab. And what I see is a woman breaking the rules of her culture. She's the breadwinner. He's probably at home looking after the children because he can't get a job. But she's here in the workplace, and not only is she in the workplace, she's working night shift. And all you see is the hijab. And if you speak to the hijab, you will get one response. But if you speak to the woman worker, you will get another one. So when you acknowledge people, acknowledge the person that you have discovered, not the person you first saw. And speak to that person, and if that doesn't work, try another one. You've often seen this happen, but I have to tell it to you as a funny story, and it happened in this very hotel. Years ago, I used to work at the Anti-Discrimination Board right across the road. And on Friday evenings, we used to walk across here and get a taxi home. And I jumped in a cab with a driver who was a Maori, and sitting next to me was a pinstriped suit that had too much alcohol in it. Typical Friday night in the city where you earn a good amount of money. And the pinstriped suit was sort of reeling all over the place, and I was sitting in a corner. And eventually, the pinstriped suit looked up and saw that the driver was a Maori. And may I say, he had hands like hams. It was not somebody I was going to tangle with. And he said, "Oh, geez, I'm in a cab with a Maori. You guys beat your wives." And I said, "Oh, sorry, I thought it was about gender, not about race," whereupon they both ganged up on me. What is a unifier? Sometimes it's gender. Sometimes it's race. Sometimes it's profession. You can't assume that people will be separated necessarily by culture. There will be things that unite them. And unfortunately, I did a little bit of what might have to be called disacknowledgement by saying what I said. It was probably a very poor choice of words, and I acknowledge it, but I was a lot younger at the time, and I've now learnt the wisdom of my ways. But you will often create alliances by priming the people whom you acknowledge in the room. When you say, "We all work here and we want this to work," think of Ken's "we" yesterday. That's what I'm picking up. All of a sudden, everyone looks around and says, "Yes, we do." And another example from the less adversarial trials process was when one of the judges said to the father in the court, "Mr. Brown, will you tell me why you're here?" And Mr. Brown said, "Because I've been looking for my children for 6 months, and I've discovered them in a third country town, this time with their name changed, and yet I'm being dragged here because I'm not paying maintenance, but I don't know where my children are and I haven't seen them for 9 months." And the judge, instead of saying, "Well, they'll take some evidence on that," in this new process said to her, "Mrs. Brown, would you like to talk about that?" And she said, "Well, yes, you know how it is in country towns." She said, "I didn't want the people in the country town to think the children are not the children of my new boyfriend whose name is Black, so now the children are known as Black." And the judge, again, instead of yelling at any of them or taking evidence, put these glasses on the end of his nose. By now, I think Stephen knows who it was. A man who is now a shadow of his former self. He's so slim. And he leaned forward and he said, "You know, we've just had a tsunami in Thailand." And he said, "Wouldn't it be terrible if we didn't know what name to give the authorities to look for our child?" The parents looked at one another. And he said, "I think with permission I'll make the first order, that the children be known by the names on their birth certificate until they make application to this court with an independent children's lawyer or until they reach the age of 15. Shall we move on?" The parents were fused at the hip around the issue of the safety and well-being of their children. That is acknowledgement. That is to speak to people's deepest hopes and to speak to people's deepest fears. So let me go back to the challenge that John Lizio gave me this morning, and that is, how do we do this? You can't do it by Q&A. By definition, you usually, and in fact lawyers are trained this way, you usually only ask a question to which you know the answer. But when you don't know the answer, and you're going to ask a series of questions, you're asking people to step into your mind instead of opening the agenda to them. So you do what I call cast a wide net. which is that you say in a mediation or in a conversation in the workplace, look, I'd be really interested in understanding how this is for you. And they'll say, look, I don't know if I should tell you this, but I used to get on really well with Mac, you know. He and I were absolutely top colleagues, and something happened about 6 months ago. I'm not sure what it is. Blah, blah, blah. You are home. You've got a wealth of things to pin a question to because they've given you a scenario that you could not possibly have reached by saying, why don't you like him? Why doesn't he like you? What caused this? What happened next? You won't get there by sequential issues because people's grievance story and their grievance is not chronological and it's not sequential, and you won't get there by Q&A. So you acknowledge the person by asking, by finding out who they are, by casting this wide net, and then speaking to all the people that they are in their full humanity. I think that the other thing that we do as mediators is that we issue invitations for people to speak. We don't force them to speak. We don't say, just a minute, Mrs. Brown, I've heard from you. Well, you can do that in a court, but you can't do it in other places. Just a minute, I want to hear from this one first, and then I'll come to you. I never use the word interruption. Because when people talk, that is what we want. We want it to feel like a conversation. But what I say to them at the beginning is, if it ends up in a situation where I can't hear you all at once, I'll probably butt in and say, look, just a minute, I'm not catching everything. Would you finish what you said, and then could you repeat what you said? And I never call it interrupting, because it is the kind of normal conversation that we have around a table where people sort of overtalk one another. So lose the word interruption if you want people to be acknowledged. Because when they burst out with stuff, the gold is in that. When they say, no, no, that isn't how it is, you know you're onto something. But if you say, could you please be courteous and could you please not interrupt, you will kill it. It is anti-acknowledgement. But we have to be brave. And too much mediation is conducted for the comfort of the mediator, not for the comfort of the parties. It's not for us to be comfortable. It's for them to be comfortable. And we sometimes feel exquisite discomfort. I was in a setting, because I was on the Native Title Tribunal, with a whole lot of Aboriginal people, and a very difficult moment arose. So I said to myself, I better have a private session. So I said, is this a good moment for a private session? They all said to me, shut up, we're getting somewhere. Now, you know, I was not terribly comfortable at that moment, but you know what? They were right. So if you are hooked on status and you feel like saying, look, do you have any idea who I am? I recommend that you don't go into this business. You'll never get anywhere. And why is that so? It's because there are 4 things impacting on communication which people are not aware are happening, and they impact on acknowledgement as well. This is the work of Geert Hofstede, and Hofstede says that there are 4 fundamental questions that impact cross-cultural dialogue, but I think they impact all dialogue. And he says those are questions we are asking ourselves, to which in different settings we don't know the answer. The first question is, how direct should I be? The second question is, how personal should I be? Third question, how do I get a turn to speak? And the fourth question, how are good relations made and kept here? Now, he says, and I agree, that the way we answer these questions is influenced by a number of factors, of which culture is one, but personality, gender, life experiences, social status all play a part, and children of any culture unconsciously know the answer by about the age of 8. And I've taken Hofstede one step further, and I actually said to him when he was in Australia, now I know why people behave like 8-year-olds when they don't know what's going on in a mediation or a conversation, because they feel like children who don't know the rules. So one of the things we have to do is not create rigid rules, but to say, look, it may be that some of what's said here today will be, you will think of it as very direct or very uncomfortable or very personal. But if any of you needs to say something direct or personal, do it. We don't have a week. We only have a day or a week or 3 days or whatever it is. So, and that's when I say, that's when I earn my keep. If that causes discomfort, I will step in. But you must say what you've come here to say in the way that you've come here to say it, and I will manage the fallout. So I legitimise direct and personal. So if people say, and I had it in a ghastly dispute in which 2 women were arguing about a lease in a city building, and I could not get to the bottom of it. And in a private session, one of them said to me, I left my husband for her, and look at how she's treating me. And I said to her, you know that I can't repeat this in the open session. What do you want to do with that? And she said, I want her to say goodbye to me today. She still hasn't said goodbye. Now, that was very personal. And it was so personal that I was uncomfortable. And I said to her, it's up to you, because you've told me this in a private session. I can't go to the other side and tell them you've said that. But if you're going to raise it, I will manage what happens. And they had a goodbye. And it was horrible. Painful, horrible, dreadful. So, we're legitimising the interactions that people need to have so that they can acknowledge each other. I didn't know you felt that way, says someone when the other person says, you upset me by firing me by text message. The moment the other person says, I understand now what I've done and I didn't realise that that caused so much hurt, there's the acknowledgement. Where's the most powerful acknowledgement? When it's done by the people in the room for one another, not by me as mediator, though that's better than nothing. But it's far better if I model it and then they do it themselves, because that's what really matters. They don't want it from me. They don't mind it from me. They want it from each other. I think we need to prepare to be affected by what happens to us, because it will be unexpected. It will take the wind out of our sails. It will ask us what in God's name to do next, what on earth we should do with what we've just heard. And that's the magic, I think, of coming up with something which is at the heart of what's concerning people and which heals some of this free-floating sense of grievance. I want to end by saying very quickly that I was involved in another project about 2 years ago, which was the Defence Abuse Response Task Force in Canberra, set up after the Skype affair. Many of you will have read it. It was on the front page of the papers for weeks and weeks. When DLA Piper did a review and called on people to come forward if they'd been sexually or physically abused in the armed forces, any of the armed forces, and they set the time limit at 50 years ago, we had 10,000 responses. And we know about breaking the silence that they weren't all there is, that they were not the full number, of which about 2,500 said they would like to be brought face to face with a member of the armed forces, interestingly, not very often, very rarely with the perpetrator, who was often dead or no longer around or whatever, not contactable. They wanted to sit with a member of the armed forces, and they didn't always want to tell their story, which I learned, of course, is important in trauma, that people should not be made to retell a story which is going to re-trigger them. They could if they wished to, but they didn't have to. And I've mentioned it in a short paper that I've written that I've sent to Max. And that is that, and I'd like to read from it very quickly. The overwhelming majority had kept the facts secret since the period immediately following the abuse and the failure of the armed services to deal with it appropriately. And we're talking about the rape, the gang rape, for example, of young men who went to sea at 14 and who were on that boat for months and months. And when one of them complained to his senior officer, he was told to, wait for this, man up. He was so manned up that he'd never lived in a house, he'd never had a job, He'd ruined about 3 families. He couldn't be anywhere with other people. He couldn't be out at night. I won't go on. It was not until this government inquiry was set up that they came forward. Secrecy and denial had devastating consequences for individuals. Just think of secrecy. Denial is another level, including alcoholism, drug addiction, violent outbursts, and homelessness. Psychological damage to victims has in every case outlived the physical scars. Years of official inaction and denial resulted in further trauma for the victims. And the process was a hybrid. It was neither restorative justice, and you'll hear from an expert in restorative justice in a moment, and it was not mediation. So we called it restorative engagement because it borrowed from both. And we had the difficult role as facilitators of sitting in the middle and being told we were not neutral. We were there to take care of the person who was the complainant. Nothing prepared me for the impact. Men and women who had kept silent for decades broke their silence and were heard for the first time, think of Ken and Joan, with respectful attentiveness and acknowledgement. Let me give you an example. One young man talked about he didn't talk about his beatings. He talked about his hopes and how they'd been dashed, that he'd wanted to serve his country and he'd left under a cloud. And what he wanted from the process was to have his discharge document changed so that it didn't say that he'd left because he was unsuitable, but that circumstances had led to his being unable to continue. And that's what he got too. Money can't buy an outcome like that. There's no amount of money that can compensate you for what you get out of being able to do that. And when he told this to the head of Air Marshal Jeff Brown, Brown leaned forward spontaneously. And I'd trained all these senior brass about what they were going to have to deal with. And they said, give us a form of words for an apology. And I said, I can't. I can't. It will just come from you if you listen. And this young man told his story. Jeff Brown leaned forward and said, oh, Jesus, Jason, we let you down. It was completely magic. And Jason said, look at that. Look at the hairs on my arm, he said. They're standing up. He said, you know, I used to be a victim, then I was a complainant, and now I'm a pioneer. Because he was one of the first of our people in this process. He was, to talk about restoration through acknowledgement, he was restored by having someone like Brown say, we let you down, not they shouldn't have hit you or what a terrible story. He said, we let you down. We didn't come to your defense. We didn't help you over this. We didn't provide the support that we would today. And he then went on to talk about what's happening today and how it's changed. And Jason, I've changed his name, was very interested in that. But what I think was most fascinating was that people told us afterwards, about a year afterwards, we went back to them and did reviews. They had fewer flashbacks to the traumatic event, improved relationships and sleep patterns, fewer outbursts of rage, higher self-esteem, and the list goes on as more feedback is gathered in the months after these carefully arranged facilitations are still taking place. And there's little doubt, I think, it will be similarly encouraging. So the ambivalence of parties in dispute is not new to us. Anger and blame, coupled with a yearning to return to the status quo, to how things used to be, even where business partnerships have irretrievably broken down. The desire for the restoration of connection underpins such ambivalence, and it's sometimes possible if mediators are prepared to go into private sessions and ask questions and listen to issues that would bring shame if asked in front of others. Why do I end with this? If you're going to acknowledge people, you have to be not an ideologue. You have to not cling to the idea that mediation, for example, or facilitation cannot have private sessions or must have private sessions. You use every tool at your disposal. And you don't throw away any tool because some ideologue told you that the best mediations take place without private sessions. That would be wonderful. There are some that don't have private sessions. I got a very nasty infection once sitting with a group that sat for 11 hours and wouldn't let me go out to go to the bathroom. You know, they really wanted to keep going, and I stayed there with them, which was a mistake. I learned from my mistakes. So what I'm saying to you is that at the end, none of what I've said to you today is new. You know this stuff already, and certainly you heard it yesterday. But acknowledging that whole person means opening yourself up to listening in a way which is new throughout the society. And I think this is a marvellous moment to hand to Stephen to say a little about why he initiated the less adversarial trials process in the family court. And I thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Stephen, will you?
I'm going to tell you a personal story. It's a journey, and it may be that later in the day I get to tell you about where I'm up to in this journey, and it may be, and I'm starting to acknowledge, I may never get to finish the journey. But what I'm going to briefly tell you about is the beginning of the journey, and I may mention some time frames where some of you may not have been born. But in any event, I was admitted to the New South Wales Bar in May of 1975, and in January 1976 the Family Law Act commenced and the Family Court of Australia commenced operation. And I happened to be the reader on a floor of chambers where certain members were eminent counsel in the area of what was then matrimonial causes under the previous legislation. And because of that, and I think also motivated by greed, I found myself doing a lot of family law. And I was there at the beginning, so to speak, in January 1976, albeit the briefs I had at that time were not very big. Jumping forward, by 1990, could I tell you I was in full swing in the adversarial system. Since January 1976, when the Family Law Act commenced, can I tell you that the practice and procedure in that court has been an absolute disaster. There's a very good book out there published by Federation Press I was looking at yesterday about case management and complex litigation management. And it's very interesting because it talks about a lot of the relevant history. By 1990, Alastair Nicholson, who was the then Chief Justice of the Family Court, was of the view that something had to be done about the practice and procedure in the Family Court. For example, the Family Court had adopted as its method of dispute resolution the processes and procedures that are adopted by the other superior courts of Australia in civil litigation. For the lawyers here, a system of pleadings. I won't go into what that means, but it was a system that proved to be wholly inappropriate for family law litigation. And what it was, Alastair Nicholson invited me to be the profession representative on a committee called the Simplification of Procedures Committee that was chaired by the late Alan Bartlett, who was the Deputy Chief Justice of the Family Court at that time. And the outcome of that was that we endeavoured, and he made recommendations that were accepted, to simplify the procedures. And for example, at that point the Family Court was using a system of pleadings and we abolished it because it proved to be hopeless. Then after I was appointed, Alastair got me, because of that experience, to take a greater responsibility in relation to practice and procedure in the Family Court. And I chaired various committees and had the responsibility for drafting various things. For example, at one point, we had tried a system whereby we would get court officers, that is registrars, deputy registrars, family counsellors and so on, that is court employees, make a record of the party's story each time they saw parties at a court event. Because what often happened is that they'd have to retell their story each time they came to a court event. And the idea was that we would have an internally prepared case management document that we would then give to the parties at the point at which they were getting ready for their ultimate final hearing, if they were. And we would say to them, whatever you do, don't put on evidence about all of those matters that you agree upon. Could I say it absolutely failed, and it was terrible. And I was tasked with the job of going around the court and talking to the registrars, deputy registrars and family consultants as to why it failed. And the family consultants were the ones who gave me the greatest insight. They, could I tell you, were very, very good, in fact better than lawyers, at getting the story from the litigants. And they said to me, Your Honour, it failed because when we asked them what the problem was, the answer was because he ran off with my best friend. In other words, something that the judge was totally not interested in at all in a no-fault divorce system, and that was the real issue. And so Alastair then realised that we had to look further afield to get ideas about practice and procedure, and he, and I was fortunate, got me to go to Europe on a study tour, and we realised there was no point going to common law countries, the United States, England, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa and so on, that we needed to look at something different, and hence I went to continental Europe and started in the Palais de Justice in Paris and was looking at the inquisitorial system. And could I also say that by that time, because of my experience with case management, I'd been introduced and became very influenced by a fellow called Geoffrey Davies, who used to be the former Solicitor General for Queensland and was on the Queensland Court of Appeal. And he was a terrific fellow who influenced me greatly because he wrote significantly about the convergence of the adversarial and the inquisitorial system. And because of that, Alastair realised, and I realised, that there was probably something we could learn from the Code Napoleon that we couldn't necessarily learn. We already knew what was available in the common law world. And this journey ended up, finally, in the Ministry of Justice in what was previously East Berlin with Judge Eberhard Karl, who was a judge of the Court of Appeal in Frankfurt. And I spent a week with him, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I came away with a very different view about conflict resolution. And I realised that the system we had, the adversarial system, was wholly inappropriate for the resolution of children's cases, parenting cases. And when I came back, with the assistance of others, including the Attorney General's Department, we formulated legislation, and we also established a pilot system which we operated in the Sydney and Parramatta registries of the Family Court. And it was at that point that Joe was introduced to me. And Joe assisted us in the training of the judges who we got to undertake this pilot, because we realised that they needed some skills of communication that they didn't have, bearing in mind they're being steeped in the adversarial tradition. Now, I made the observation to Jo this morning when she invited me to speak here now. I said, I wish I knew then what I know now. In other words, since we undertook that pilot and since I've started to undertake mediation, I wish I knew at that point a lot more than I did, because I think we could have made it even better. But in any event, because of the work that Jo did with us, it became a success. And we had it evaluated both quantitatively and qualitatively, and quantitatively by a psychologist from Victoria called Jennifer McIntosh. And I can recall when I chaired the first meeting when she introduced to us a preliminary report, and her message to us was, you are not causing any more harm. And we were terribly embarrassed by that, because the inference was, and it was, she stated it boldly, that the system we had been imposing in the resolution of these conflicts was causing more harm. It was generating conflict. The evidence that was being placed before judges was what I call womb to the tomb, commencing with I was born on and finishing with yesterday afternoon. And it was all about the misdemeanours, the bad behaviour of the other parent. And the resolution of those disputes was all about determining which parent was the worst parent, and not focusing on the real issue, which was what's in the best interest of the child. And we had it the legislation looked at because we were concerned about the constitutional ramifications of introducing this inquisitorial approach, and we had it evaluated by a former Solicitor General who said, no, you'll get away with it. The High Court will agree with it, and they will agree with it because it's litigation about someone who's not there. You're determining and making a decision about a child who's not participating in that process. And what you've got to try and do is to focus on the interests of that child and not their own conflict. And that was the point. Now, the difficulty is, of course, it's within a legal framework. And so you've got lawyers involved, judges, who are steeped in the adversarial tradition. And you're changing mindsets and asking them to do things in a way very differently to what they've done before. And it's for that reason that, in my opinion, it's likely to take generational change. And I'm a great believer in the fact that the conflict resolution, for example, in family law at least, should be taught at the tertiary university level. It's at that point that it should be started. I've no doubt about that. And that's why the uptake of this less adversarial approach, in my opinion, has been slow, incrementally slow, because of the mindsets of lawyers who are involved in the process. But I think it will change, and I hope for the better, because what it demonstrated to me at least, was the importance of trying to find a method for conflict resolution. And I realised that, at least in the context of parenting cases, we had got it all wrong, and we probably still do have it wrong, quite frankly. That's where I'm up to. I'm now still on that journey of trying to work out the resolution of conflict, and I must tell you, I'm bumbling. Sorry?
Is that on? Yeah, it is. Good morning, everybody. My name's John McDonald from Proactive Resolutions, and we deal in the world of conflict. I was fascinated listening to Joanna this morning, and it made me think that the word acknowledge, as I understand it, is a combination. It's a very old English word. It's a combination of two words, which was ack and know. And it literally meant to remind myself of what I already knew. So one of the things when people come together, when they're in conflict, and they start talking, we know from neuroscience these days that the physical act of speaking to people that are part of your intimate community and being listened to helps you understand yourself, what you've experienced and what you're experiencing. So, acknowledgement is a very powerful part of what we need to do with each other. And I was knocked over yesterday by reflecting on what a bad listener I am when I'm not doing my job, because my job is all about listening to people, but when I go home, I don't think I shut up. So I had a night of silence last night, and the family wasn't really aware of what was going on. I'm going to show you some excerpts from a good Aussie film, and it probably takes up a third of my presentation because I think it demonstrates the mess that is conflict, and it demonstrates how difficult conflict is for us to understand and get caught up in. And as we say in our business, we get into conflict all by ourselves. It's almost impossible to get out of it by ourselves. So the context for this film, it's a film by an Australian filmmaker called Michael Reimer. Michael is a Melbourne boy now living in LA. He has other works. I don't know if you've seen Battlestar Galactica, In Too Deep, Angel Baby, those sorts of films. So he's a good filmmaker. The film's based on a David Williamson play, and the content for the play was taken from a number of what we call restorative justice conferences that we've done in the workplace. So the setting is a blue-collar workplace. In our work, about 70% of our work is corporate and government work with conflict, about 30% is blue-collar. So this is, and the context, you'll see the context set up with the first one where a young bloke basically gets a bit pissed off when he's been sacked. And as they say on the news, there is language here which will offend you, so cover your ears if that comes up and you're not wanting to hear it. So it shows the incident that presented that we then became involved with. And then the second one goes to the conference when we're well into a conversation, which sometimes can last all day, 7-8 hours. And the point I'm making there, and I'll explain it afterwards, but the point I'm making there is that it shows that things that would appear to have nothing to do with why we're there are actually significant contributors to why we're in conflict. And there's a little bit at the end. So can we just roll the first section of that, please?
Yes!
That's the incident. That's what happened. I mean, that would probably get most people the sack at work. He was sacked because he'd been fighting with a couple of his mates. And what happens is you pull the system of relationships, that's the people in this workplace together for what we call a restorative justice conference. And we start with the young bloke that you saw get out of the car there having to tell the story about what he did. And so he talks about driving into his boss's place and ramming the car into his boss's car and a few other things. And then people say, well, when you did that, this is how it affected me. So they get the opportunity to talk about not so much what happened, but how we feel about what happened. Because in our world, there's nothing you can do about the facts. You know, as you alluded to, we can argue endlessly about the so-called facts, and we know how unreliable memory is. But you can't argue with how people have been affected by what they understand has happened. So we're fast forwarding here to well into the Restorative Justice Conference, where the young bloke has started to talk more about the bullying that happened to him at work. And he was a guy with slight intellectual disability, by the way. So let's just go to that if we can.
And when you fix your car, I'll come back and I'll smash it again! Huh? Will you look at...
lovely little line, what are you looking at? Can we go to the next one?
Oh, what is this? Huh? Those are the fucking girl guides all of a sudden. Jack, I'm not apologising, okay, mate? I'm not going to start hugging everyone. What the fuck is this? You ever worked in a place like ours, mate?
I've worked in worse, mate.
You won't get him to apologise. He's the bloody ringleader.
If you've ever worked at a place like Baldoni's, right, you know that everybody takes the piss out of everybody all the bloody time. It's the only way we stay sane. You take it, and you give back as good as you get, yeah?
The only one who was taking it was Wayne.
Right, okay, so who do you think was taking it before Wayne came along, Maureen? No? I was, right? You know what, fuck it, apologise to me too, mate.
Come on, everyone cops a bit of stick.
Huh? Right, I've been in this country since I was 8, right? And you call me a fucking, what was it? All your Arab mates are good for is blowing yourselves up. That's what they said. Apologise to me.
Mate, it wasn't that bad.
No? What, over the bloody loudspeaker system? Hakim is barred from the lunchroom because he eats stinking wok food. That's what they said.
It was a joke.
It was you that made the announcement, Richard. Right? Bloody foreman. Boss, you reckon he's setting a great example? Mate, you know when I walked into the lunchroom, right, he had a sign on a chair in the middle of the warehouse, right? And it said, Al-Qaeda eats here. Remember?
It was a joke.
I got that part. Mate, you know I eat pies, right? With dead horse and everything, I love it. And they say I eat stinking wog food.
Why'd you make the announcement? I didn't think of the idea. Mac and Nookie, you know, they pressured me into it because they wanted it to sound official.
Why didn't you say no?
Exactly. Why didn't you say no?
Oh, shit, mate, you got to fit in, especially if you're the foreman. Otherwise, I think you're too big for your boots.
You, Mac. Jackie does everything they tell him, mate. Okay? Does everything anyone tells him. Here's something you didn't know. He sold us out to Greg.
Shit.
No one sold you out.
No? Mate, it's the worst workplace agreement I've ever seen. Okay? There's no overtime rates, there's no nothing.
No, I didn't push you all.
No, not much, Richard. No. Oh, we don't need the bloody unions, he tells us. Yeah, Greg will look after us. Yeah, right.
No, this is the first I'd heard of you being so unhappy, Hakim.
Greg, everyone is too shit scared to say anything to you, mate. Right?
Hakim, we're not here today for you to say stuff that's going to make it difficult for you at work, okay? Be careful.
Where did you work that was so bloody bad?
In mine.
Yeah, well, this job's fine for Wayne, okay? He does the same dreary thing day in, day out. He doesn't even care. I mean, look at him. He loves it.
Don't talk about him as if he's stupid.
Listen, let's stop all talking shit, okay? Wayne, mate, I'm sorry, okay? But you're not the brightest star in the sky, mate.
I'm not stupid. You call him stupid one more time.
Barry,
I'll lock you
sit
on
down.
right here and now.
Barry, come on, Barry, sit down. Sit down, please. Come on, mate. Come on, it's not
I
helpful.
get
Sit down.
upset and I get confused. Not stupid.
Mate, I'm just saying that the sad thing is you're the one going, okay? And you love this job. We all hate it, and we stay.
Hakim, if you hate it so much, why don't you just shove off?
Let's not make threats,
To
Greg.
where?
Hang on a second. I've got to sit here and listen to him tell everyone how much he hates working for me?
We're being open here today, okay? We're saying stuff that we normally wouldn't say.
Well, I can't see any bloody good coming out of it.
Greg, there are a lot of factors that destroyed your Jaguar, and we're just trying to work through some of them, okay?
I just get upset. All right? And confused. That's what I get.
Miners get well paid, right, mate? At least they get well paid. Jack, we're the bottom of the barrel, mate, okay? We're the shit of the earth, and we know it.
I've got a mate starting a business in China, right? Now there are millions upon millions there who would be happy to do the same work as you for $1 and 2 bowls of rice a day.
I'm not in bloody China, mate.
But why should you get 100 times more than them, huh? For the same work? This is an international bloody economy. Why should they have, a special union to protect them? Why?
It's called Face to Face. You can get it on video or DVD or something like that. It's a wonderful exploration and demonstration of how messy conflict is, how messy the conversations are when we bring people together in conflict, how difficult it is for us to truly listen to one another, but how extraordinarily well we do as groups of people when we do have the opportunity to come together, get some clarity around how we've fallen into conflict, develop a kind of broad and deep understanding of how those behaviours have made us feel, and then and only then decide what can we learn from each other so that we can get on better together. And what it shows you are that, when you say who are we talking to in the room, I mean, it takes hours for us to learn more about each other. And that's a daily event for my guys in our business, facilitating that sort of conversation. And I'm sitting here listening to Joanna this morning, realising there are so many different ways to do this. We are so completely minimalist that you almost wouldn't know we're there. There's no such thing as a private session and all that. I've never done mediation training, so I've obviously, maybe one day I should, I think. But I want to just make some points and then open it to conversation. The language, I love language. It's good because I only speak one, and I live in a household where people speak three. My wife and children speak other languages. There's an industry called the Alternative Dispute Resolution Industry, ADR, and I think Hugh didn't know what that meant yesterday. Disputare means to clear up the mess or the misunderstanding together. It has Latin roots. We've used it forever in this business. I think it's the wrong language. Conflict or conflictus. Conflictus means the clashing together of swords. So we're in the business of conflict, we're not in the business of disputes. Although there are loads of disputes in conflicts, if that makes any sense. I'll just whip through these and the facts. It's down here. I can read it here as well, sorry. Insisting on the facts exacerbates the conflict. It's like throwing fuel on the fire. So what we tend to do in our work is acknowledge the facts and then move right on as quickly as we can. You can't ignore them, but don't hang around them because you'll be stuck there forever. The number of people in a conflict by definition always involves more than two people, always. And if it's in a workplace, it will probably at a minimum involve a dozen people or dozens of people. And there are always more than two sides. So when people say there's two sides to a conflict, I'd love to come along to a workplace where there's only two sides to the conflict. We say there's a minimum of three. There's the people who are with me, the people who are against me, and then there's the poor buggers in the middle who are kind of in the demilitarised zone, and we both hate them, and we both try to lobby them to get them to be with us. The questions, there was a lot of this stuff raised yesterday, but why don't we talk about stuff? And I say why do we avoid having conversations that can prevent conflict? Because we don't want to have conflict. We want to avoid conflict. After 5 years in business of going into organisations and government agencies where people were in conflict, we kind of regrouped and said, hey, we need to develop something that can allow people to engage with each other, because underlying every single conflict we've dealt with in the last 20 years is this inability for us to slow down and engage to the point where we can genuinely listen and then communicate. So it's a problem of engagement with each other. And organisations have what they call grievance procedures. So you have a right, if you're unhappy with the way you're being treated or someone's bullying you or something like that, to go to paper and put a formal grievance in. And what typically happens, if I'm unhappy with Max and we work together, and I go along to my supervisor and say, Max has given me the monsters, can you do something about it? He's been bullying me. My supervisor will probably say, listen, put it on paper and give it to me and then I'll do something. That's the default position. And then, of course, I do, and it goes into the machine and gets gobbled up, and the machine says, don't talk to each other and stay away and all that sort of stuff, and the conflict just exacerbates. And we get driven further and further away. I can tell you now, the policies that we have called grievance procedures, the grievance processes, are great policies because they say, if I've got a problem with Max, go and talk to Max about it. But I'd rather crawl over cut glass than go and talk to Max about something I'm unhappy with. So I go and talk to everyone but Max. That's how we work as human beings. And it's not, it's unhelpful, it's not bad behaviour, it's very normal behaviour. We are kind of hardwired to avoid conflict. So if we're going to have those policies, we need to support them with protocols and processes and techniques and skills to help us have do the one thing we don't want to do, which is talk to someone. So the other thing that's interesting here, this is a little formula, you've probably seen it around, it tells you about the number of pairs of relationships in a system of relationships. And it talks to the complexity of conflict when you are part of what we call a political species, which we are as human beings. So if let's say there's 10 people in the group, that's 10 multiplied by 10 minus u, which is 9, so that's 45 people. 90 divided by 2, which is 45, which means if I work in a group of 10 people, there's 45 sets or pairs of individual relationships in that, which is one of the reasons technically we choose to bring the whole system of relationships together at the same time, at the same place, because politically it's just too messy and complex to deal with in any other way. Couple of little things there. Whatever process we use to deal with conflict, if the people that are caught up in it are excluded from it, don't get to participate, they're going to be pretty upset and undo whatever you come up with. If there's not an opportunity to have your say, to feel in some sense equal while you're in the room, that is, all workplaces are hierarchical, so it doesn't hurt every so often to hop out of the hierarchy and have a conversation as a group of people which is not related to the hierarchy. When you want to get to an agreement about what to do tomorrow in the workplace, then you've got to get back into the hierarchical arrangements, because whatever you agree to has to happen within that community, that work community. Deliberation simply means if I've got a beef about something and for some reason I don't get to have my say in that meeting, I'm going to walk out of there feeling upset and unhappy. So we have to, deliberation simply means to talk things through. And this notion of non-tyranny, whenever we bring people together in a conflict, there's our sense of authority and power and things like that at play. So one of the jobs of the facilitator is to do their best in a non-tyrannical way to make sure that no one can bully anyone else. But of course, in the process, we use the Restorative Justice Conference. If you do have bullies there, then you want them to do that in the conference, in the meeting. But you want it to ease off over time. I could say a lot more about that. The importance of emotion. The biggest learning we've had in our business over the last 20 years is that the old, idea of Descartes that I think, therefore I am, it was approximately like that, is only half the picture. If he had said, I feel, therefore I am, he would have been much closer to what we are. But I think the full picture is I think and feel, and when I'm well, they're integrated, and therefore I am. So emotion is hugely important. It's what gets us through the day. It is powerfully contagious. You cannot be proximate or in the same room or even looking at a screen with another human being if you're normally wired and not be contagious by how they're feeling. It's that important. I mean, you all know how Bill feels when you look at that, no matter what culture or what part of the world you come from. You know how Liz feels. Pretty unimpressed. I think a commoner must have touched the food or something. And I mean, that woman, can anyone tell me how she feels? Distressed, overwhelmed, distressed. Her name's Oksana Bayul. It's the moment she won the gold medal for figure skating at the Olympics. But she's overwhelmed with too much relief. It's a great story. But the point of that is Emotions, feelings, affects are powerfully important, powerfully contagious. We speak to each other all the time. They are universal. They change only in terms of the display rules of the culture. But when we're not aware that we're being observed by another human being, we wear our heart on our face all the time. Look at people in the car. When you're driving past them, you'll know exactly how they feel. The other thing that we do when we go into a conflict, these are kind of random points, but I think they're kind of trying to pick up on a lot of things. We never psychologise a conflict in the workplace. Even though I have a team of forensic psychologists that work around the world, conflict at work is not for us to be psychologised, it's politicised. That's what we do. We see it as a system of relationships where people have different authority, different sense of power, are more or less articulate, all that sort of stuff. There are times that I will say that it helps to have someone hop out of the system of relationships, go over to the employee assistance program, get some therapy, some help, some conversation. That's always helpful. But to do that in isolation of the system of relationships that that person works in and lives in is completely useless usually. When you hear John's the problem, and I hear that a lot obviously, but when you hear John's the problem, we go into workplaces, people present you with the file and they say, listen, John's the problem, he's been like that forever, and everybody you talk to say, mate, he's a piece of work, I don't know why they leave him here, how they ever hired him years ago, I don't know, and everybody bags the crap out of John. And of course our response is, it's never John that's the problem, never. There's all this talk about psychopathy, psychopaths in the workplace. So what if they're a psychopath? We still have to work with them and figure it out. You know, diagnosis is one thing, dealing with it's another. If John's a really difficult person and rude and disrespectful and so on and so forth, our typical response is, over time, in our preparation to bring people together, so John's not the problem. If John's not the problem, who is? So who do you think is the problem if John's not the problem? Yeah, it's us. It's everybody that's tolerated John's disrespectful behaviour for the last 10 years and said nothing because they didn't want conflict and didn't want to upset John. And they say nothing and we say nothing for very understandable reasons. So we've all let John down. We've not given John the support John needed. We've given John the support John wanted. And they're often very different ideas. So leave John alone is the lesson from that. Next one. Conflict in the workplace, it's complex, it's political, and it provides an opportunity for us to learn more about ourselves and others. I've got to say, I'm never comfortable with conflict. I never enjoy conflict, and I never agree that conflict's a good thing. I think it's always a bad thing. It's a horrible thing to be caught up with. Those of us in the industry think it's lovely because it offers us opportunities and we can see the potential for it. But the people caught up in it actually are desperately unhappy. Wonderful what's happening there, but I mean, we asked this question, who did it and what do I have to do to them? Now, I'm a father of 5 children, now adults, and I well remember them as little ones arguing, complaining, coming in and saying that's not fair, etc., etc. And you know, you'd say, well, okay, who, right, in the room, or you're not sitting in front of the TV. You know, these days I just take the phone off them if they were little or whatever. There's all these big punishments. So you listen to it, you do your little investigation, you impose your sanction. Then I was a school teacher, and the last school I was at was Cabramatta High School. I spent most of my time doing investigations into crime at school, and then talking to the deputy and the principal, and together we'd impose a punishment or a sanction. We would. Then I went to work for the police for 10 years. And lo and behold, what do we do as cops? We go out, we investigate a crime, we find enough evidence, we hand them over, and the state somehow imposes a sanction on them for doing something. We feel compelled to ask these questions. I set up my own business, and what happens? Someone misbehaves, and I find myself going, who the hell did that? Well, what are we going to do? Can we sack them or not? They're the wrong questions, and they inform a whole lot of ways that we interact with each other. These are the questions that we should be asking. You know, what do you understand happened, so you don't ignore that something's happened? What do you understand happened? Because when you pull people together in a conflict, they all have a very different experience about what happened, but they all will agree that this happened, whatever it is. Then let's cut to the chase. How have you been affected by what happened? And only then can we say, what can we do to make things better? So that the first set of questions assume I will know what you need to do. It's very restricting. It's an onerous responsibility for anyone to have, and we typically get it wrong. The second set of questions hand things straight back to the people who own the conflict. Now, one of the things I found in Australia is that culturally we do not sit down and have conversations about things that are difficult. We would rather, we call it the mother model at work. We'd rather flick it off to human resources and get mummy in human resources to come in and fix it up for us. And it's that simple. So culturally, we try to avoid these things, or we look for someone else to deal with the shitty stuff going on in our lives at work. What we present is the most difficult option for people, which is we are going to come together and challenge and confront each other and see what we can learn about the situation so we can make it better. So here's the little punchline that we've learned over the last few years. That kept apart, we're capable of the most unbelievable treachery, and we see it in all the countries around the world. We work in about 30 countries. We've seen it all over the place, both in the workplace, in governments, in communities. We can be absolute bastards to each other and relish in it and be very good at it. And it's incredibly sad and harmful and painful and tragic. Kept apart. Brought together, we're capable of the most extraordinary generosity and understanding and empathy and need to connect. So, you know, it seems to us that if we can figure out how to slow down and come together and engage and communicate and have a genuine conversation, we don't need anyone else telling us how to fix our stuff. We do extraordinarily well at fixing it ourselves, time and time and time again. So these are all little marketing things, obviously, at the end of it. But so that's what I have to say. I think I've taken up enough time, Max. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think it's time for a break. It's been fantastic. We'll have 20 minutes, and then we'll move on.
Fantastic.
Just prompt me. I forget these things. Just tell me if I don't do it. To figure out what I'm doing. I'm now satisfied that what's edited and comes out of this is going to be a worthwhile product, because this is really one-off, I think. Well, John Lizio, my old friend who's here, he said to me, the next one's got to be a workshop. People have got to learn. He said, it's been great, a lot of information, but people need to know how to do it. How to do it. That's right, and that's exactly what I'll do. You know, they bloody give us all these little tables and there's no place to put any bloody thing. Where's Joanna? I've got some questions from Dale. Where's John? Oh. Okay. I better not take up too many chairs. Okay. Is that, Michael, we right to go now? Thank you for that. We've just wanted to point out to you that there's a camera going to be, or is set up over there now, and at lunchtime or during any break, if you're interested in saying something about the conference at all, then there'll be a cameraman that will be interested in hearing from you, whatever you want to say about it. And that'll take place during lunchtime as well. In fact, there'll probably be somebody outside or wherever you're having your lunch might approach you and ask you whether you have something to say. And I suppose at the end of this, during the course of this day, if you haven't got something to say by now, then all the talking and the listening might not have done too much. But you know what I mean. You're welcome to do it and to be helpful if you could. We're on track, even though we're not strictly running in accordance with the time frame. We've got enough latitude in the afternoon. And of course, as you can see, it's scheduled for us to have a drink and a talk after the event. I'm quite looking forward to it. I said to Bill, having put all this together and invited so many people, I've hardly talked to anybody. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity. But so now we can enjoy what Bill Hewlett has to say from his perspective as a very senior trainer of family law practitioners in ADR. So I can introduce you to Bill Hewlett, please.
Thank you. I always think at this point I should have thought about what I was going to say. But I'll tell you a joke first of all. Saying we are 90% water, which makes us like cucumbers with anxiety. So I came into this world of dispute resolution from doing a variety of different jobs, came into quite late. And started working as a counsellor, a therapist, and then trained as a child consultant and find myself in the mediation world because child consultants are brought into mediation. So it's an opportunity for therapy to get into a world where therapy was found almost like a dirty word at one stage. Couldn't use the T word around mediators. They get really cranky and it was always about outcomes and pushing for the issues that the clients brought to be resolved, be they the amount of time that people spent with their kids or discussions about what school the kids should go to or they should have a double-barreled name or not. And there's all these agendas that people would bring to mediation. And I used to find myself writhing with discomfort as these things were hammered out and the clients were kind of sitting there mute and unable to really voice what they were not happy about because it was the agenda. It was all about the agenda. It was all about the outcome. And I found myself very unhappy with that because I was thinking about the kids and how the mum and dad, even if they resolved this issue that they came to mediation about, would be going back still really cranky with each other. In fact, probably even more so because to some extent mediation kind of resulted in the end of someone kind of giving in. It was never really a case of both kind of reaching this sort of higher ground and going, hey, wow, that's amazing, let's be great friends from now on. So after coming from a therapeutic background, which is what people kind of hope to get from that, going to mediation and feeling really disappointed about what low expectations they were and how they were just about stuff. And interestingly, I thought the agendas that people brought to mediation were like dishes in the sink. The issues were something that they discovered that they could use to kind of clobber each other over the head with. So, they suddenly, the law changed and it was all this business about equal shared parental responsibility. And so people were coming in and saying, I've come for my rights in terms of my right to spend 50% of the time with my child. So that became the thing they sort of clubbed the other person over the head with. And really, for me, that wasn't the issue. It was about upset, it was about loneliness, it was about desperation, it was about hopelessness, it was about abandonment, it was about sadness, and that wasn't really getting dealt with. So I thought, well, the world the children are living in hasn't changed, and I felt bad about that, particularly as in Australia, as many of you know, the family relationship centres were set up in response to a report by Patrick Parkinson, which talked about the effect of entrenched parental conflict on children. So I'm thinking, well, where are the children? well, we're not doing anything about the children here. We're arguing about how much time you spend with them, but we're not doing anything about the world that they live in and the fact that mum and dad don't get on. So I became increasingly interested in how can we make mediation much more therapeutic? How can we help the kids' world get better by getting mum and dad to get on better with each other? And because I'd kind of started off in a therapeutic environment, I knew a little bit about attachment theory, and I knew that children who grow up in a complicated, stressful, difficult, conflict-ridden environment end up having to deal with the consequences of that in their later life, whereby they're not particularly good at relationships because they're so busy surviving this environment that mum and dad are kind of, the chaos that mum and dad have kind of got going on in their lives, that they have to spend most of the time coping with that and not spending much time learning how to be rounded, relationally aware, confident, self-esteem, understand relationships. They miss out on that if they're busy managing chaotic environment. So they get into relationships with each other. They don't really understand each other very well. They're not very good at putting themselves in the other person's shoes. They jump very quickly to conclusions about the meaning of the other person. They live in a state of probability, not possibility. So they're always anticipating that someone, if they say something, they might be having a go at them. So they're highly reactive. So this doesn't augur well to be a parent if you feel like that. I looked at trauma theory and discovered that people who grow up in traumatic environments are very socially disadvantaged. Interesting. There's a fascinating piece of research that happened in the 90s called Adverse Childhood Experiences. I highly recommend you Google it. And really, it's amazing that the whole world hasn't changed its view on children and trauma, because the link between childhood trauma and adult disease is just extraordinary. The connection is huge. So we can see that being in a traumatic environment as a child is massively disadvantageous for your life as an adult. So I could see the evidence in the mediation of the childhood trauma in my clients, the fact that they were so reactive, the fact that they weren't able to kind of sit comfortably with something that you could kind of see two ways. I suppose you could take offence by that, but then maybe, it's not meant to be offensive. Maybe that person didn't put it well, or maybe, you're being kind of overreactive. So, there's all this evidence in the room, I felt, of people having experienced trauma which had disadvantaged them in terms of their relationships. They didn't really understand relationships that well. They didn't understand themselves that well. Like, if you don't know yourself very well, because you've been so busy as a kid living in a difficult environment and learning how to survive, calming mum down or cheering dad up, or, trying to sort of manage this adult world with your tiny childlike brain, you haven't had the time or the opportunity to sit under the stairs and fantasize about being a prime minister or something. You're so locked into the awful reality of day-to-day life and the stresses that you have to watch out for, that you're not in that luxurious position of developing a great deal of imagination or creativity or confidence. So trauma theory kind of supported that. And then I started to look at Ian McGilchrist's work. He wrote this amazing book called The Master and His Emissary, which is about the left and right hemispheres. It's fantastic. You have to read every paragraph about 30 times, don't you, before you kind of, oh, shit, that's amazing. It's really, really dense, but oh my God, is it amazing? And so what I kind of realize is that so many of the processes that are on offer to us, like mediation, like the law, like education, like hospitals, all of these institutions have been kind of manufactured to be expedient. And they're about economics, and they're about measurability, and they're about competencies, and they're about things that can be kind of rolled out to lots of people for a minimal amount of money. So here we are talking about a process, a human-to-human interaction between, say, a mediator and a client, and a process has been designed systemically, mechanistically. Education, if you ask a group of people, how was school for you? 3/4 of them go, well, wasn't that great? But the education's supposed to be about learning and becoming are curious, not about being sort of pushed through a sausage factory and popping out the other side with this very kind of, I mean, apparently education at one point became systematized because the Industrial Revolution happened. We needed to educate people to a particular level so they could manage factories, and another bunch needed to be educated to a level where they could work in the factories. So the whole idea of education became much more about fitting into a society rather than growing and learning. So what I discovered was that, so the idea of the master and the emissary is we have two hemispheres in our brains. The right hemisphere is very relational, holistic, big picture, and very good at sitting with ambiguity and incongruence. And it's happy to sit in grey, effectively. Left hemisphere is much more about operationalising, bureaucratising systems, logic, linear, sequential. Not particularly good at relationships, not particularly reflective, not very good at admitting it's wrong. Left hemisphere is very certain about itself. It's good to say that the left hemisphere lives in a hall of mirrors, and everything it sees is a reflection of what it already knew. And what it's very keen to do is prove what it already knew is correct. Well, I was thinking about barristers sometimes, full of bluff, full of certainty. Oh, I'm absolutely right. And I think about our clients, and they come in absolutely right clients. I'm 100% correct. And the other person is 100%, not even 1% correct. That sense of certainty seems to be a propensity that we have, particularly when we're up against it and we're doing it tough. Obviously, if you're in mediation or if you're going through a court process, you're feeling a bit stressed, you're feeling a bit, like you need to kind of defend yourself. You're going to naturally incline yourself towards that sense of certainty. So here we have a process which is designed to bring about change. That's why people come to court. That's why people come to mediation. They want to change their lives. And the process that's on offer to them is using a bit of brain that doesn't like change. So I'm sure 10 years from now, people will go, what were you doing? Why did you think that would work? Like, why do you think that having an agenda in mediation, where people bring in their problem-soaked problem, like a gridlock issue that they've never been able to resolve, bring that thing they've never been able to resolve into a mediation room, mediators say, come on guys, be nice, don't forget this is all about sort of, collaborating. Why don't you talk about a subject you've never been able to talk about before really constructively? And let's come up with some really great left-of-centre ideas. What do you think? No, that's not going to happen. There's no way that people who are feeling so diminished and stuck, when they are asked to consider an issue that they've never been able to resolve, how they're going to get all creative and come up with left-of-centre ideas. So that was the thing that used to worry me about mediation. I didn't know until I kind of did all this research what it was that I had such misgivings about, but I began to become increasingly aware of the fact that the process we have on offer, this sequential, logical, linear process where you do this and you do this and you do this, isn't going to work with people, because people are more complex than that. And besides, it's not taking into account the social disability that a lot of our clients have. I mean, in reality, these people haven't been able to work it out themselves, haven't been able to talk to a neighbour about it, haven't been able to talk to a friend about it, haven't been able to watch Oprah and think, maybe I do that. Maybe I should stop doing that. Maybe it's actually not working for me that I kind of always behave that way. Maybe I can see a bit of a connection between how I behave and how the world treats me or other people. That's not happening. Not having these moments of reflection. So what's the point of offering a process that doesn't bring about growth or learning, or people at the end of their process being actually able to live their lives in an altogether more instructive, more informed way than they were before they came through the process, rather than just whacking a Band-Aid over them in terms of whatever issue they brought in and sending them out. That's not doing the kids any favours. That's not doing them any favours. They're none the wiser after this process. So I became very interested in, well, how do you do that? Now, at one point, I worked for Relationships Australia in Canberra, and we had a a contract with the Department of Corrections, and they were sending us clients who had been found guilty of domestic violence offences. So I would talk to these men, 24 weeks it was, I have to go through this process, 24 weeks, and we would do this thing, it was called Duluth process. It was about men taking responsibility for violence. And every time, at the end of every session, we'd say to them all, so are you now of a different view about your violence? And they'd all go, no. I still married, a woman who makes things up. In fact, I married 3. What are the chances? And I am in no way responsible for what happened. And I'd go to my grave holding on to this view that I have nothing to do and I'm not a violent person. So I began to sort of see the futility of this. It was also getting very boring, 24 weeks, at the end of the 24 weeks. So are you prepared? No. Okay, you need to do another 24 weeks. See you next week. Oh, God. So it was really, it was like pulling teeth. It was awful and unproductive. But one thing that I did hear the men say was that they didn't like the idea of going home and the kids running away when they knocked on the door. They didn't like the fact that when they walked into the kitchen, the mother of their children had that sort of scared look on her face. They didn't like that. They weren't in any way prepared to take responsibility for it, but they didn't like it. And I said to them, well, how would you like the kids to behave when you walk in the door? And they said, I'd love the kids to go, Daddy, and run up to me, and I've seen other people do that, and I'd love that. But, it's not happening because she's brainwashing them. So they obviously had a theory as to why it wasn't, things weren't going their way. So they didn't have that insight into the consequences of their behaviour and what followed on from it. So they didn't like not being popular, but they weren't prepared to acknowledge that it was their fault. So there was this funny combination of people behaving in a way that was doing them no favours, but not being aware of it, and complaining about it and having reasons for it, but nonetheless not being able to kind of do anything about it. So I was saying, well, why do you think they run away from you? And they would say, oh, because their mum has told them I'm a horrible person. And I would say, well, what would the mum say you do that makes her think? I'm not suggesting you are a violent person. In fact, to me, you seem like a great guy. But why? What would she say? Why would she say they run away from you? And she would say, oh, well, she would say that I'm kind of scary. And I would say, because I was conscious of the fact that this person's sense of integrity, sense of self, was really, really important. This person had obviously existed in such a scary environment as a child that he had to develop this very robust sense of self, where he couldn't allow that there might be anything wrong with him. He was so defended that he couldn't say there might be something wrong with me. He just couldn't go there. It was like opening a Pandora's box. God, if I say that, all these other things that I've kind of suspected about myself might be true, and I just can't go there. So there's a sense of needing to protect themselves. So I was beginning to think, how can I help you hang on to your sense of integrity and your sense of being an okay person while you have a look at your behaviour? How can I help you see what other people see without you feeling ashamed or blamed? Because I can see as soon as I in any way suggest there's something wrong with you, you just shut down. And telling you you're violent and saying, can't you see, blah, 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 is not working. So I began to notice that if I really commend the intent of the man I was talking to, not his behaviour, but his intent, he was prepared to have a look at how he looked to other people. So when I asked him, what would she say you do that makes the kids run away? He in time would say, she would say, I look scary. And if I said, well, what do you do that makes you look scary? He would say, well, I shout. And if I said, what is it about shouting that she thinks is scary? He would say, well, you could see that the dots were getting joined up. He was beginning to see what other people were seeing. He was beginning to understand how other people felt in his company. He was beginning to see the connection between how he behaved and the sense that people made of him and who he was. So when I went into the mediation world, I was thinking about this sense of integrity, these people coming in and saying, it's got nothing to do with me, I've done nothing at all, in fact, I've been angelic. And the only reason my relationship didn't work out is because I married a narcissist. I begin to think, like, you're so stuck, you're sort of stuck in this cage saying, why am I stuck in here? And why is my life impossible? And why has this person decided to dedicate their entire life to making my life a misery? And the only way my life will ever get better is if she dies or has a lobotomy. Because she's decided to make my life a misery. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but aren't you making her life a misery too? The incongruence between coming in and saying to us, I am regularly letting the other person know that I hate them. I'm getting my lawyer to send them letters. I'm telling them every time I see them. I'm telling my kids that they're awful. I'm telling everyone I know that they're terrible, and I know that she knows this. And for some reason that's a bit beyond me, she doesn't want to cooperate with me. There is that extraordinary incongruence that people present with conflict. It's like conflict turns us into another being in some ways. And I was thinking, if you could only see how she perceives you, and you could think about how you might attend to that, then this conflict that you're in, where you think she's doing this to you and she's decided to dedicate her life to making your life a misery, actually could stop. But you can't just say, can't you see, you idiot? Can't you see what you're doing? You've got to kind of keep them feeling okay. They must feel well regarded. And I like that idea of that, the Buddhist kind of loving kindness thing, or Carl Rogers' positive regard, where you love your client, where you find something about them that you find utterly compelling. And if you think about the child coming into the world, wanting to be welcome, wanting to be accepted, wanting to be included, wanting to be well thought of, every single client who's coming in wanted, when they came into the world, to belong and to be well thought of. And so I found myself talking to that person, not necessarily thinking about the behaviour, but thinking about that innocent human being who came into the world wanting to belong and wanting to be well thought of. And I started talking to that person, and I looked for their intent, because everybody who comes in complaining, I think many times, this was touched on many times yesterday, the complaint hides a statement about self. So when the client's saying, oh, she's a terrible mother, she doesn't feed the kids properly, the kids are, the sheets are dirty, she's got all these dodgy blokes, in the house, and she drives the kids without seatbelt, and they don't go to school on time. They're saying something about themselves, which is, I'm not like that. I found myself saying after a while, you know what, the thing about you that really strikes me is that you are a mum who provides this wonderful, I don't know, it's this lovely sense of warmth, and I don't know, it feels secure. I think they're so lucky to have a mum who's so keen to make sure that the sheets are clean, and the food is healthy, and the house is warm, and there's these lovely things around. And you see this person like, yeah, actually. And what I started to notice was that the better the client feels about themselves, the more generous they are about other people. So it was a kind of, I need to fill her up until she's full up. And when she's full up, she can have a look at everybody else. But while she's empty, she can't do anything other than look after herself. And so if we have a process, mediation, family law, that's not filling people up, they're not going to have the capacity to think about other people. They're not going to have the capacity to use their right brains, which are very generous and holistic and relational and wise and big picture. They're not going to be able to achieve that because they're in no state to. So when you talk to mediators about filling clients up and making them feel good about themselves, they go, "Ooh, no, that's rule. You're dangerously transgressing rules about impartiality and neutrality. You've got to keep them at arm's length and not in any way make them feel that you like them, because then they'll tell the other person, oh, the mediator liked me, he's probably not going to like you." And oh, for God's sake, this is ridiculous. This system that's so ridiculously risk-averse that we don't achieve anything. It seemed to me like the whole system was set up to make sure that, yes, you may not do any good, but at least you're not going to do any harm and we're not going to get into any trouble. And I've been working in the UK recently, and everyone's terrified of doing something wrong. But how are we going to do anything right when everyone's so frightened? So I found that if I found some way of commending the intent of my client, and I had to do it a lot, and I had to do it very poetically, and I had to be very creative about how I describe my client. I couldn't just keep saying, you're a great mum. I'd have to keep saying something about the way that, I don't know, I'm just thinking that if I was your kid, I'd have such a sense of you being so reliable. I feel you would die for me. I feel you would give a kidney for me if I was your kid. I have to keep on and on looking after my client. I have to be very creative. Mediators go, don't say that, for God's sake. But nothing ventured, nothing gained. And besides, I found that at the end of my process, where the clients eventually ended up saying something along the lines of, okay, I can see that the way I've been perceived has been problematic for me. I can see that the way I'm perceived has led to conclusions in the other person that I don't like them. And I can see that that's actually a problem because I can see that motivates that person to not like me. I'm always asking about, what would the other client say you do that leads them to feel that they're justified in taking this position of being so opposed to you? As I gently ask these questions of incongruence, really, with a great deal of support, they are given the opportunity to have moments of insight into how they appear to other people. At some point, I want to ask, what does the other person think you think of them? And they go, sorry, what? What does she think you think of her? And you can see that. This is a bit of brain that hasn't been used in years. If you went into the brain, people are going down corridors with candles. We've never been this part of the brain for absolutely decades, trying to sort of see our way across this other part of the brain. It's like, no, I've got a whole list of stuff here, my warehouse of resentment, which is right next to me. It's instantly accessible. I'm popping in and out of the warehouse of resentment every couple of minutes. And the files just pop up, and it's all incredibly easy for me to find. You want me to talk about what's wrong with her? I got tons of stuff. It's like a warehouse. I've got stuff goes back years. I've got people in there, I've got forklifts bringing stuff down. There's so much stuff there. But you ask me to think about what she thinks I think of her. Ooh. In time, the client's going to say, well, she would say I hate her. And I go, hang on, she thinks you hate her. And I let that sit in the room. I want time for this message to kind of settle. She thinks you hate her. Now, the relational brain, the right brain, loves stuff like this. It's got tons of wonderful material to show the client how they are perceived by other people. They've never been given a chance. The left hemisphere has been so busy sort of babbling this narrative of righteous indignation, this constant noise like a shark, has to keep on churning through stuff under the impression if it stops pouring out information, it will die. The left hemisphere has to be quietened. That happens in relationship. That happens in a context of attachment. That happens in a client sitting in my company, feeling wonderfully got by me, safe with me, possibly for the first time ever. So that the other part of the brain that's always had this information is allowed to present it. And it's always incredibly simple, and it's always incredibly wise. This moment of insight where they see how they're perceived. They get a sense of how it felt to be the other person. They look at themselves through the other person's eyes and they feel what that person's felt. It's called empathy. And they haven't been practicing it because they, as children, were never in a luxurious position of being able to experience that. But they can happen. The brain is there. We need to be very careful that we don't come to conclusions about our clients based on how they initially present. Because what you're seeing is a much diminished person. What you're seeing is a person who is locked in conflict. And it's been horrendous for me being in the UK, looking at how people are coming out of an adversarial system that shows no interest or compassion whatsoever for these people. It's just one adversarial process after the next. I'll tell you what, things are amazing here. I can't believe, like I thought things weren't good here before, but my God, it's fantastic here in comparison with clients arrive saying, I know that being in conflict is problematic for my children as a given, and I know my lawyer's going to be supportive of that. Well, they're not saying that over there. So, finding some way for our clients to gain some reflective capacity, to gain some insight into how they are perceived by others, is enormously advantageous because they will go to the next session where we're going to work out what we're going to do in mediation with some degree of acknowledgement, saying, I have played a role in the situation I now find myself in, which is very different to how people normally arrive in mediation. Normally people arrive in mediation having, in their first session, talked at great length about how badly treated they are and have someone kind of write it down. What's the point of that? So if they are helped to reflect upon how they are in the world and how people have experienced them, they're able to be party to some ideas about how it might be different. Now, at no point do they have to say to me, I now am prepared to agree that I was at fault. Their sense of integrity has to remain intact all the way through the process. At any given time, they would continue to hold a view, and even at the end, that they weren't really the problem here, but they are prepared to take some degree of responsibility for what's happened, because they can see now that the way they've been perceived, not that there's anything wrong with them, the way they've been perceived has led to conflict. So, you've got a situation where you've had a conversation with mum, and maybe she's got to some point where she realises that even though she's a great mum, in fact, because she's such a great mum, and because she's so passionate in terms of her defence of the children and her absolutely commendable desire to protect them from any moment of discomfort, maybe she may have been perceived on occasions as a little overprotective. She said it, not me. I'm just dumb and curious. I'm just kind of highly supportive and I'm just exploring the incongruence of, well, you seem like a great person to me. Can you help me understand what other people would say that leads them to feel differently to I do? She's got to that point of saying, yeah, okay, well, I can see that my commendable desire to protect my children might have been perceived as protective. I'm just going to let her sit with that in our conversation, because she will then, because the mohawk of self-awareness, where basically there's a line of bits of brain all kind of join up with each other, and I'm kind of artificially helping this client join these pieces of information, whereby she's come to some conclusions, she in her own mind might have decided, maybe I'll be a little less protective. And I might say to her, so, and this is before we've all got together, this is a pre-mediation process, one-to-one meeting. I might say to her, so if he was to meet you, I don't know, sometime before we all get together, and on this occasion he found himself feeling quite optimistic about how this is all going to pan out, what would you be doing or saying that led him to feel like that? This is my way of testing where she's gone with these thoughts. So we've kind of stimulated this moment of reflection in the knowledge that it will progress, because that's what brains do, into thoughts of action or behaviour. So I'm checking to see, where have you gone with this? She might say to me, well, if I was to meet him, I might tell him that he's a good dad. Now, the great thing about something like that is I didn't get her to think it. She thought it by herself. See, what happens in a lot of mediation is the mediators try and push you towards saying something. And as soon as you do that, you're taking the control away from the client. If you can remain genuinely curious and non-directive, which is not easy because there's a lot of chaos around, and you want to look clever as a mediator, but if you can resist that temptation, and you let them come to their own ideas. I mean, I never would have thought of that, but it sounds good to me, and she knows him. So, and I might say to her, so, do you think you could do that before you meet him? Because because I'm very keen that because he's probably thinking, I don't know, I haven't met him yet, but he's probably thinking if I asked him, what does he think the problem is here? He's probably going to tell me it's you. And she'll go, oh yeah, that'd be right. He would definitely say it's my fault. So bearing in mind that he thinks that you're the problem, because he thinks you're incapable of change, do you think there's something you could do before we next meet that might help him kind of review that? So she might do something between now and when we next meet. She might say something to him that's a little bit more friendly. She might do something that she knows really matters to him, because of course she does know what matters to him because they've argued about it endlessly. And I might have a similar conversation with him. He might have had some point of insight. He might have had a reflection upon how he has behaved towards her. Maybe he's very conflict avoidant. He starts off saying she's a crazy woman, and as soon as I open my mouth, she's into me. And I took off. I left because I wanted the kids to not be around conflict. So I actually left as an act of generosity. And I'd say, that's really commendable. That's really, that must have been really hard, because you are obviously a dad who loves his kids. I don't laugh while I'm saying it. And I am looking for that, people are, demonstrating pieces of behaviour. You'd think, oh God, I don't think that was a really good idea. But it came from a place of good intent. Everybody comes from a place of good intent. And it needs to be acknowledged. And if it is acknowledged, and with a lot of people you have to acknowledge it a lot, compellingly, poetically, colourfully, before they will finally think, yeah, actually that is true. I do come from a good place. And I'll know when they've been able to shift to a different position from, different from the one they present where they initially come in, which is full of I'm right and full of righteous indignation, and they use language, it's all very blaming, and you'll notice the language change as you go through this process. And to a large extent, it's simply about this connection, this sense of human to human connection, this strong sense of I really like you, my client. And I'm not just going to say that, I'm going to prove it, because I'm going to list all the things that are great about you. And you can hear the language change when you're talking to them that way, because they'll start to say we, or they might even start to talk to her about the relationship, as opposed to she's this and she's bipolar and she's narcissistic and all this kind of stuff. You'll hear them move away from that to altogether more generous language. Everybody has that capacity to be more generous. We're seeing people at their most diminished. That's not all there is to them. We all dropped into Syria right now. We'd come across a bunch of very messed up people. If their lives improve, they will change. They will, so let's not make conclusions about our clients based on what they're like when they're at their worst. And of course, they're making conclusions about each other when they're at their worst. And kids are saying stuff about their parents when they're at their worst. So I'm not going to take anything that anybody says as it's a given, this is how it has to be. Well, we're all capable of a spectrum of behaviours depending on how we're going. So let's suppose the dad has realised that perhaps this strategy of removing himself from the family as an act of generosity might be perceived by others as indifference. Because I'm very supportive and because I'm very, I'm looking after him and I'm topping him up, he might be prepared to think about it. I might say to him at some point, so what did they, so the mum stayed around and she had a lot of contact to do with the kids, and you left and you had none. When the kids were thinking about you not being there, what sense did they make of it when they looked around and you weren't there anymore? What sense did they make of it? I mean, I get that what you did was fantastic. I get that. But I'm just wondering, what did they make of it? He would have a little moment of insight into how that might have felt for the kids. It might have felt like abandonment from the kids' point of view. It might have felt like he didn't care. And he might, with a great deal of support and a sense of me commending his intent, be able to see that perhaps, even though it was well meant, this behaviour might have been perceived as being indifferent to the welfare of the children. And I might ask him, so if that was the case, would the mum be nervous about you being around because she might think you might do it again. I mean, I get that would be the last thing you'd ever do, but I'm just, it's just kind of top of my head, just throwing it out there kind of thing. And he might think, well, yeah, I suppose that might be perceived that way. So if she was to meet you, I don't know, next week or something, before we all get together, or hear from you, I don't know how you communicate, what would she notice about you that kind of led her to think, this is going to be good? Hopefully, as a result of his kind of reflection, he might then think about what he might do to address that. And he'll come up with something completely unique to him. Hopefully it'll surprise me, which means I haven't nudged him that way. I haven't tried. I really don't want to sort of say to clients what I think they should think, because I don't think that will last. Hopefully he'll say something that will make me think, yeah, I think she'd probably like that. So they will have had something to do with each other. Their anticipation that the other person's always going to come from a bad place will have been a little bit kind of shaken up. Not entirely. It never will be entirely, but a little bit. So when they come to the joint session, they're not quite as fixed as they used to be. And they've seen something in each other that's also impacted on that. Plus, they're still basking in the glow of all my adoration of them, which I keep going. And now I'm holding on to both of them in the joint session. And I'm using lots of externalizing language about it. It looks to me like this relationship was never well set up for you two. You guys are chalk and cheese. I mean, between you and me, I don't think you ever should have got together. I think you made a big mistake. But, hey, you got some lovely kids out of it. So we're talking about the relationship as a system, as a process that people use to interact with each other, and they are starting to use that language as well. They're starting to talk about the relationship. It didn't really help us when we were at odds with each other. Then, of course, we've got the kids. They're both parents. They love their kids. You've got this lovely kind of Darwinian drive for the ongoing survival of the species that very much works in our favour. We've got ways of presenting information from children to parents where they can see how their conflict is impacting on the children. No shame, no blame. And any of that coming into this process, these people have built up these defence systems to prevent themselves from experiencing shame and blame. They're able at some point to articulate to each other how the other person would be behaving if that person seemed to be able to take on this idea that conflict is problematic for children. This allows them to finally cue each other correctly. If we go back to the beginning of when I was talking, how people, as a result of attachment trauma, have miscued each other, have learnt mechanisms, processes of coping with difficult situations that are problematic because they send a message to the other person that is a miscue. It's hard to understand. So they've miscued each other. That's led to a breakdown in the relationship. That's led to very concrete opinions of each other. We've been through this process of insight. We've been through this process of externalizing the problem. We've been through this process of them both agreeing that an alliance between each other is a good idea. And now we're articulating what exactly are the criteria for this alliance to work. And we're asking them in their own words to say what the other person would be doing if that person had clearly taken on board this idea that an alliance is important for the children. And the really fascinating thing about this is, and I think it kind of really fits with everything we've heard yesterday and today, ultimately what they say is, I just want to be treated like a human being. I, as a dad, would love my role as a father to be acknowledged. I, as a mum, would love the fact that I soldiered on and kept things going when everything fell apart. I would love to have that acknowledged. That's really, for me, the biggest sticking point. I know that we're fighting about all these different things, and I know that we've got really immersed in this big conversation about our rights, but ultimately that's what I want. And I would say, so what would that look like? If you, Mum, were seeing Dad in some ways communicating this sense of acknowledging how it was for you and how you soldiered on when everything fell apart and how you kept going as a mum. If he was doing that, what would he look like? What sort of things would he be saying? She'd say really, really simple stuff. You know what? He would smile. he would say, I'm a great mum. I'm looking at Dad, and he's thinking, is that all you wanted? Is that what we've been fighting about? Is that what all this stuff's been about? You just need me to smile and say you're a good mum? You are a good mum. I'm happy to smile at you, So, and he might articulate what would matter to him. So we are helping these two finally acknowledge, forgive, and protecting them from the need to go to a harsh place. We are holding them as they go quite quickly, if you think about it, from a position where they've come in of feeling absolutely, victim of a horrendous other, to discussing with each other how they're going to collaborate quite quickly. Really, people often say to me, all this stuff you're on about is all very well, but we can't possibly fit it into the mediation process that we're currently running. I think, what exactly are you doing in this mediation process that's not actually about transformation? And if you are doing something that's not transformative, why are you doing it? So many of in institutions, we have to collect data. We spend an hour with the client and an hour at the computer, justifying what we've just done. It's nuts. There's so much progress needs to be made. We shouldn't be doing anything other than really powerful, transformative, emotional work, working with them emotionally. Emotions will drive thought. Thought will not drive emotions. Work with their hearts, and they will, especially if you look after them, happily comply. They've all known in some way that things need to be different. It's just that the thinking they've been using about how it would be different is so limiting. Conflict language is so unable to articulate better, more generous, kinder. The processes we offer are steeped in conflict language. Our way of thinking, the way we ask people to bring an agenda, the way we ask them to consider what options, are deeply dysfunctional in terms of that state that they need to get in. I found myself, when I was kind of taking over in this mediation process because I didn't like where it was going, the mediators were hating everything I was doing because we seemed to be getting away from the outcome. But I thought we were moving somewhere really important, which is these two understanding each other better, these two understanding where conflict came from, these two understanding what they did that made conflict happen, these two beginning to understand how the other person experienced them, and the simple things they needed to avoid conflict. A smile, or some sort of acknowledgement, which if you don't have a sense of being a victim, you're happy to do. Like our clients are lovely people. I know when they present, they don't seem like that, but that's what conflict's done to them. So I feel that there's so much needs to happen. I feel that there's so much. We need to be so far from where we are now in terms of our institutions, our processes that are on offer, these economically driven, sort of rational processes, which I understand if you need to roll out a big system across a country. I understand things have to be systematized. They have to be countable. Things need to be in blocks that can be kind of justified economically. But this thinking is not conducive to change. It may be efficient in some level, but it's not about better. It's not about higher. So we really need to go back to the kind of foundations of the thinking of the processes of what we're doing. Sorry, you want to ask a question? You might have to shout. Oh, here we go. You shout me. You say to me, and I'll repeat it.
Okay.
Oh, good.
There we go. A fantastic presentation. Everything you're saying is just resonating so loudly with me. My background's behavioural science. I'm an FDR practitioner. fully support the ACE research as well that you were mentioning earlier. Just wanted to share a story. I did my placement actually with the Relationships Australia, FRC, Family Relationship Centre, the government supports, and it was an interesting situation because I found that they do have a long waiting list for a start, and I think people in trauma, I find that it's very hard for them because it drags it along, and obviously with the children, and they're all in this serious conflict situation. And what happens is they wait so long, actually after their intake, their pre-mediation session, they wait so long to then get to mediation that actually then they have to do a refresher pre-mediation intake, which I found completely crazy because I come from a background of workplace conflict resolution. So in business, you just couldn't really afford to be doing this over and over again, doing the same thing because it's taken so long to get to the second place. And then in mediation, I found that the practitioner was going round and round and round in circles for, a 2-hour, 3-hour period. And at the end, basically achieved nothing. And I just found it so frustrating because I thought, well, I don't know, there was no transformative, there was no understanding of where things were established. And all that you say, I just wanted to say, I think it's fantastic, and I totally support what you're saying.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Max says I can go for as long as I want. That's communication, isn't it? You're right. I heard what I wanted to hear. Sorry, yes, you had a question?
First of all, thank you very much. I love every way that you... Sorry, thank you very much. I love the way that you're able to experience the past in the present in a delightful way, in a delightful sort of... There's an entertaining aspect to it, but that's real, so it's very easy to watch you and listen to you, so thank you for that. And I'm very pleased that you're able to bring in the biology, the physiological aspect of what's going on, that we're not pretending that that isn't part of it, because I agree with you 100%. And I'm also wondering if we open up the conversation to the schoolhouse, the schoolyard, the whole business of education, because these children that we're talking about, there's lots of them. We're not talking about a small number who have somehow fallen under a rubble of an earthquake. We're talking about the world's children. And their incapacity to be able to access that generous part of their brain is going to be the next generation. And so this work that you're doing, I think what would be lovely is if we could take it into somehow the school. I know that restorative justice has been part of the education department and mediation too, but they're still looking at it from a conflict point of view. But I think bringing in, well, I use the word compassion, but bringing in compassion into the way that we operate as a society, I think that's the next level of where we as mediators or as practitioners in conflict, that's where we should be going, is how can we bring this into a social way of consciousness? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, interestingly, Ken Robinson, another well worth having a look, just TED Talks, Ken Robinson, he talks about education and how mechanised education, and he says it should be a human system, not an education system. And, we've all become very focused on outcomes and evidence-based, and, in many ways, I think science has been kind of held up as a beyond, we don't need to look at science, it's innately right, but actually there's lots of aspects to the way science thinks that is blind. And we should, hold an openness to generosity and optimism. With my clients, I'm enormously optimistic, and they love it because they're not at all. And actually, in reality, there's good reason for me to be optimistic because there's only two of you, and the only thing that's between what you want and where you are now is the ideas you have, and those are totally flexible. So there's nothing wrong with being optimistic. It's just as valid as realistic. So yeah, I agree with you. There's kind of needs to be, in ways, you need to go back to the really fundamental philosophy that everything is predicated on.
A factor that both parties are acknowledging is that if the pre-mediation doesn't occur, in which you provide an occasion for some self-reflection, some awareness of the role that each party is playing to the outcome, and if in fact you might have someone else doing the pre-mediation, as sometimes happens in certain relationship centres as a matter of expediency, or there's a delay, as this lady talked about, a long delay between the pre-mediation and the mediation, the sort of the alchemy of which you speak is not able to do its work.
I know. And it's about institutions, it's about bureaucracy, it's about, you know, and you hear all the time, that can't happen. We don't have time for that. Our structure doesn't allow it. Well, why not? Who said? Why? You know, if you go to the Attorney General, are you okay with the fact that you are operating a process that doesn't allow people to do any good? I'm sure the Attorney General will say, well, that doesn't sound like a good idea.
As we're having a part of a sort of a wider conversation in terms of science, it's like we do hold science to be so correct when in fact the whole scientific method is part of that certain part of the brain that we're using, which means that the hypothesis is really only, you know, bringing us into that hall of mirrors. And that leads us, you know, the bell curve leads us to always think in terms of probability rather than possibility. So
yes, absolutely. And again, you think about if you haven't got any with your client, it's probably you, the practitioner, that is lacking. And you need to think about the thinking that you bring. All of the assumptions, all of the basic fundamental truths that you bring might not be. So we really have to look at ourselves, the absolute you know, got to go right back to the basics. Yeah.
So unused to thinking in terms of possibility.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask Bill about training then, about mediated training. One of the things that we were commenting on the other day was the difference between the mediation training that we do as lawyers, 40 hours, and say, okay, now you can mediate, you get your certificate, and away you go. In the family law arena, Yvonne's just done the course where we met you, that took, I don't know, someone said it's 800 hours, but whatever it is, it's much bigger, and the disparity doesn't seem to be justified. From what you've said, it's ludicrous that if you're going to mediate effectively, you need to have an extensive array of training and a lot of skill development.
Absolutely. You know, when I went into mediation from therapy, everybody that I was leaving in therapy world was feeling sorry for me because I was going to the place that was dumb from their point of view. It wasn't considered to be a high art. I think dispute resolution is incredibly difficult, and you have to be really, really in charge of yourself. You know, I look back now on those willing counselling clients who came in wanting to do something about their lives. Oh my God, what luxury. As opposed to people come into mediation not wanting to be there. I'm only here because my lawyer told me that I have to get this piece of paper before I go to court. There's nothing wrong with me and I don't want to talk about it. I mean, you know, you're really up against it. So getting good at working with people who are very reluctant is hard. It's really, really hard work. And I do think that, I think the family relationship centres, when they started, they had 5 days of training, and people would come from, they might have been in IT, they might have been a doctor, they might have been a teacher, you know, they wouldn't have had a lot of experience. 5 days, and there they are sitting in front of these two people who haven't spoken for 5 years. It really was, and because everything had to get running quickly, there was a lot of corners cut, and it's only now that we're beginning to realise the complexity of the work. And we're having to retrospectively train people because they're not able to deal with the intensity that people are coming in with. And people are going through the court system and then coming to these places. So they've been very much bashed about in lots of processes before they get to mediation. So we really have to be extremely sophisticated in our work.
Could I just ask you finally, and then we're going to go to a panel discussion before lunch. You and I have had discussions about this, I want my day in court. And I think in our exchange of questions, Ken added, what can we do to make people have their day in court without going to court? I take it from what you have is that you must be looking often at people saying, I don't want to mediate, I want my day in court.
Yeah, because you want someone in authority to say, you've been done. You've had a really tough time. There's a lovely saying about you don't need forgiveness because you need to work this out with the other person. You need forgiveness because you need peace. You need peace in your own life because being in conflict with someone is awful, especially in intense, intimate, breakdown relationships. It's all-consuming. And I think people are looking for something that acknowledges that vindicates that. And I think we either work with the clients so they can give each other that vindication, or we can provide it. It needs to be acknowledged, as you were saying, Joanna. They're stuck until they hear that.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Just take a seat and we'll bring these others up. Ken, could you come up and Joanna and John, where is he hiding? He's gone to the toilet probably. Wherever you like, Ken. John can... Oh, here he is. We've got these questions that came in from Darwin that we haven't dealt with, but maybe we'll talk about it at lunch, rather than do it now. I think what we'll do now before lunch, I invited Joanna to facilitate a dialogue with.
Is it Ken?
Yeah, Ken was. I thought.
One of us is facilitating. We'll work out who it is.
Yeah.
No, you.
But we'll all answer your question.
Joanna.
Thank you for your comments before as well.
Thank you. It's working fine. I'm specifically...
Could you speak up for us?
Talk a bit louder, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill, just specific to you again. So where does that leave solicitors and barristers as accredited mediators or FDRPs? Because I've found that there is... I apologise for...
for what you're about to say.
Yeah. I find there is a fairly serious conflict in that, you know, they have this brief training. I mean, domestic violence hasn't even really been on the radar as far as training goes for solicitors. And it's only now, in Queensland anyhow, it's only now being introduced. There's a new, Queensland Law Society family violence book that's only just being released. And I just think, as a FDRP, I did a graduate diploma, so I studied a lot in family violence, so at least I have that. And I just think from a solicitor's point of view, where does that leave them with regard to all that you've just said? And are they doing harm if they're coming from an adversarial point of view? And I apologise for any offence I may have been causing, but thank you.
My experience with an interdisciplinary collaborative team was one of... it's interesting, so we were in a team with lawyers and, I guess, social science mix, and we spent a lot of time with each other, really at odds with each other. Culturally, you could not have had a bigger clash than we had. Over time, we became to understand them much better, and they became to understand us much better. Here we had a bunch of lawyers who seriously didn't like the law that they were feeling they were practicing, and they loved the opportunity to have a therapeutic voice in the room. So very often they would sit there. Interestingly, after a while, if we had a big meeting where the clients were there and the lawyers were there and we had a financial specialist, a room full of people basically, and after a while, if the clients started to fight with each other, lawyers would start writing busily, sort of, you guys fix that. So, you know, I was really very conscious of the fact that what they had learnt gave them nothing in terms of how to deal with that. All they had was that process of, come on guys, this could go worse for you if you went to court. They didn't have a lot of other stuff at their disposal. So I would say that most family lawyers I know don't like how their clients feel. One lawyer said to me, you know, the worst thing about being a family lawyer is both clients hate you at the end. Your client and the other client hates you at the end. And it's deeply upsetting to be part of an adversarial system for the lawyers as well as the clients. And they have no supervision, and they're in this kind of very competitive kind of environment where they can't share their concerns with other people because it's seen as a sign of weakness. And, you know, like, it's a really tough place to be, and I feel for them. I feel that it's, and they love it when they discover this other way. So people often say to me, oh, lawyers love to drag it out, they make more money. I don't think that's why they do it. I think it gets dragged out because the process they offer drags it out. And, you know, someone once said there's something about year 2 at law school where they do something to your head. And it's never the same. I don't know.
Well, it's what they say in the High Court of Australia. You walk in and you bang your head on a low-hanging beam and you turn left, which I love. I thought Mike might have wanted to comment on that same question, and maybe Ken. Mike, do you want to add to that question about the different roles?
Yeah, I think I come across a lot of people who don't like their jobs. And be they teachers, lawyers, police officers, the people I've mixed. And again, I think it's because they're trying to answer the wrong questions. I think there's very little emotional feedback for people in their jobs, which is key. So I know with cops, they find it hugely dissatisfying to hand someone over when they've done some work on it. You know, so I think I've had fundamental problem with the whole way we approach each other and engage. I think it sucks. I think it's the old saying, it's fundamentally flawed. It's designed to factor out the way we feel, which is our primary motive.
As you said before so clearly, Mike.
Yeah, and I think but I have great sympathy for people in organisations and agencies that are trying to manage changing our protocols and systems when we have a political system which puts every senior executive officer on a short-term contract. So it's a risk-free environment in terms of senior leaders in government agencies and also in corporations. So you get a lot more freedom in corporations if you can show results. You know, but it's in terms of government policy and that, it's no one take any risks because you will not keep your job. I mean, you literally won't. So, you know, the whole factoring in of us as humans, what we need to engage and feel and think and work together, is being factored out, and it's tragic.
Ken, will you comment?
Is this on the lawyer's point or?
And just on what was asked about these perhaps even the interdisciplinary team and people learning in that way.
I think there are countless ways of defending ourselves against the experience of pain. And law is one of those ways. Psychology can be one of those ways. Mediation can be one of those ways. And what's useful, I think, is to see that every one of us brings a different set of experiences, skills, and problem-solving styles to whatever the problems are that we are encountering. And sometimes when I do trainings, I will ask this question at the very beginning of the training. Who knows more about conflict, me or everybody here? And the answer is everybody here, of course. And who knows who's best at handling a particular dispute? And the answer is it depends completely. Let me say it a little bit differently. I think the answer is that it doesn't depend so much on what your technical background is. That gives you an angle and an approach that can be useful in some cases and may not be useful at all in others. For myself, I have watched nursery school children mediate absolutely brilliantly. But what's useful about working in teams, cross-functional teams, particularly male-female teams, cross-cultural teams, teams with kids on them and teams with grown-ups on them, is that out of that diversity comes a great deal of strength. And this, of course, is a part of what we know about the conflict resolution process in general. There's a second part of this, which I think feeds into what your whole theme of what you were describing. And the question is, what is it that defines what mediation is? And I believe the answer to that is the nature of conflict. And it isn't either psychology or law or anthropology or sociology alone. Each of those, every single discipline that you can think of, has an angle, an approach to conflict that is useful if we can sort of bring it into our toolkit. So science is one of those places, and you mentioned Ian McGilchrist's fabulous book, and you also mentioned poetry. So which one is right? And to some extent it depends on the kind of question that you're asking. But both of them can be right, and that's the fundamental kind of orientation of conflict resolution, is that it's possible for there to be multiple correct answers. And you, in one of your slides, you said there have to be two or more in order for there to be a conflict. And the multiplicity of sources is just something that is staggering, and it's one of the things that makes this such exciting work. So, I'm sorry, I'm sort of circling back to the answer to the question, which means that every single person in this room will mediate completely differently and, to some extent, absolutely brilliantly, and in a way that all of the most experienced people here could never duplicate. And that's beautiful and valuable.
Can I add something to what Ken said? Your point is a very, very, very important one, because you're saying, how do we bring people who might be stuck in a particular paradigm into another paradigm? And I find giving people what I hilariously, I hope it's hilarious, call post-reading. I'm not interested in pre-reading. I think when people are interested in something, they'll do good post-reading. So when I do judicial education and they say to me, gee, where does all this stuff come from? If I say psychology, they go like this. And if I say sociology, they put their hands over their ears. So I recommend that they read Martha Nussbaum's book, Upheavals of Thought, The Intelligence of Emotion. Martha Nussbaum happens to be the Ernst Freund Professor of Law and God only knows what else, classics, I think, at Chicago University. She is an absolute leading light in the legal field, and she's saying, why are we ignoring the emotional element of people in courts? So, in other words, I want people to feel that they can embrace something that has come from within their own profession's development, so that I'm not saying to them, you're wrong and he's right, because that would take us right out of what we heard from Bill and from Mike, and indeed from Ken. So I'm saying to them, I think you'll find that in your own field, people are doing this differently. And I've been working a bit with judges going into diversionary courts, doing some training with them so they can decide if they want to be in a court where nobody goes to jail. And it's difficult for people. And I've been working with Roger Dive of the drug court in Parramatta. And he is completely extraordinary. He never does anything alone. He has a Bill Hewlett, a Mike Roddy, a sociologist, a health worker, a youth worker. He never speaks without his team. the results they are having are extraordinary. And he said the bean counters will end up using my program because you put a person who's a drug offender in jail, it costs $160,000 a year, I think, to keep them in jail, or maybe it's more, and the recidivism rate is 80%. He said you put them through our course, which is a 24-month course, and they go to jail if they breach the terms of the course. So it's not hug-a-thug. It's a very stringent process. His recidivism rate is 20%, and it costs $16,000 to keep someone on the program. So he says, in the end, the bean counters will come with me. I just have to keep proving that this works. And he couldn't be more, or could not once have been more of a black letter lawyer, but he wouldn't open his mouth without Bill and Mike and Ken at his elbow.
Or John.
Or John, yes. I'm sorry, or John. I keep saying Mike, and I mean John. That he wouldn't talk without his team around him, because he recognises that the interdisciplinary nature means that other people will have skills that he can't bring to that. He can bring something else. And it's that which I think is such a marvellous development.
Could I say something about the lawyer's perspective on that? Because the question raised, and it was interesting that you said, I say so with apology and I don't want to offend anybody. Indeed, one of the reasons I got on this journey was what Stephen talked about. When you come from an adversarial background, and when I did the stunt yesterday about the wig to get it, initially it was more of a sight gag for people to understand, just to listen. But when you look at the issue, what we've been talking about today is, and that Bill was focusing on, in the system of the law, then someone would go to elect him. And when you ask me that question, I'd say, well, what's the evidence base for that to say that lawyers aren't suitable? Have you got any facts? And yet the whole debate that we've had in the last 2 days is to demonstrate that really what you need is a hat, and not necessarily one particular hat, because all sorts of hats. And it depends how you wear it. And you change it depending on the situation to make it work for you. So so it's a movement, what we've learned, it's a movement away from adversarialism, because it really isn't helpful at the end of the day, and that's why the court system should be used as a last resort. But the other thing I'd say in defence of lawyers is this, is that, and in fact it's interesting to come back to the basic proposition, when people engage lawyers, I'm not sure, I think John said it, I think it was John who said it, about, well, you haven't been able, oh no, I think it was Bill, you haven't been able to solve this problem, and so you've come to me. Well, when people hire lawyers, they come in and they say, oh, I've got a problem. Now, the lawyer, it's always said that the lawyers have been the gatekeepers to dispute resolution. So when you go to see your lawyer, that's a critical point as to what you want. And a lot of people say, I don't know how to deal with this problem. You're the expert. Hello? You might be an expert in the law, but you won't be an expert in the problem as properly defined. And I want to assign this problem to you because I can't do it and I can't face it. That's the implicit conversation that takes place. And on the other side of the ledger, what the lawyer's saying, you leave it to me. I'm the expert. And that's why you see such horrible things in mediation that I've seen, where a Queen's Counsel, when his client tried to speak, put his hand up almost in the face and said, you do not say a word. And it was the clearest example of the assignment of the problem and the assumption of the responsibility for the resolution of the problem, such that they actually exclude the client from the process. And that's the thing that I found frustrating. And I think Joanna talked about it as well, about, I'm now going to hear from the wife, and the lawyer gets up and says, the wife's furious because of this and this and this, and here's why we're going to win in court. And I found that very telling. And you say, now we're going to hear from the wife, and she's going to say what my real concerns are.
Especially if you don't refer to her as the wife. If you refer to her as Mrs. Brown.
Yes.
Because she's more than just a wife.
Yes, I'm sorry, I've done it again.
She's all these other people.
I've done it again.
No, you haven't. I think that's why it's so important. But, I think the audience has other questions. But I think what you say is critical, Mark. And Max, you've lived it. They come to you and they want you to take it away. And yet we know, listening to Bill and to Mike Roddy, that the best outcome will be very often available to them.
Yeah. I think that there's a larger realization that we can get to about what it is that we are doing. And the larger realization is that this is actually an evolution of our problem-solving skills beyond the law. And the reason that I say that is because the fundamental principle of conflict resolution is not that you begin with the rule. Instead, you begin with the human beings, and you develop, the rule evolves out of the conversation between the human beings. Whereas the principle of the law is, there is William Blake says, the same law for the lion and the ox is oppression. And the same law for you and me is also oppression, because it doesn't regard who I am or what makes us different or unique. And what conflict resolution allows us to do is precisely to discover what and to cherish and celebrate what is unique about each individual human being, and see that that is actually essential to the creation of any form of justice. So in the book that I wrote 2 years ago called The Dance of Opposites, there's a chapter on theories of justice that emerge from law and that emerge from mediation. And they're fundamentally different. But having been a judge myself, I can tell you that justice is almost accidental in courts of law. The only place where justice actually emerges is through the conversation and the ability on the part of both people to be recognized and have their needs and interests acknowledged and recognized. And that doesn't happen ab initio. It doesn't happen from the beginning or abstractly or as a matter of first principles, except through this process.
Hello. I was interested in the thoughts from the panel. You've come from such diverse backgrounds. If you were starting your conflict resolution journey now or from the beginning, where would you go first? What would you study? What experience would you seek? What trajectory would you take based on everything you now know?
Can I get it right and say John? Because I have dubbed him Mike, and he is not Mike, he is John. John, will you go first?
I've been called a lot worse than Mike.
No, well, let that be the worst that ever happens to you. Sorry, Mike. This is John.
You know, it's an interesting question. I kind of just fell into this role because I have an Irish Catholic heritage and I was combative by nature and not satisfied with what was on the table. And as a teacher and then working with New South Wales Police, you just saw disasters and unhappiness all around all the time, and our response was so unhelpful, really. And I mean, I guess if I was doing it all over again, I'd pick up the themes of this conference and learn how to listen much earlier in my career, rather than assume that I knew what was to happen. So, the way that we operate now is we are essentially listening machines, and then we come back into our office and we pour it out to each other, and we cipher through and look for patterns and issues and incidents. And when we come together with people, we almost say nothing, because the work that Bill and Ken and Joanna are talking about, we do very, very similar things. It's when in the process we do them, I think, that might differ, but it's the same incremental, hard learning journey about ourselves. So for me, every time I go into a situation, it's not about me, it's about the individual, and the big challenge is to get the person to be able to slow down and reflect on themselves. And I never understood that when we were starting at all.
Live large and meditate a lot.
Do you mean literal meditation? Sitting in
absolutely. I think you need to know yourself. I think if you have a resource, which is you, and you have a sense of how you would feel, you have a great empathy. And I think knowing ourselves is hard in a busy world where we have an awful lot of unnecessary noisy chatter in our heads. Moments of quiet and stillness for me are everything. I feel like my practice is 100 times better because I am a regular meditator.
Ken?
I second that statement. I meditate for an hour every morning. And if I didn't do that, I couldn't do the work that I do. It's absolutely essential. And I think a second piece is to be curious about other human beings and to search for kind of what you were describing, the places where sort of beneath the words that people are saying, what they're actually asking. The questions that they're asking themselves, the struggles that they're going through, and not separating yourself from people, but being willing to experience those things yourself. I wrote a book that you mentioned, I think, before, is called Mediating Dangerously, and the opening quotation is from Goethe, who says, "The dangers in life are infinite, and among them is safety." So the other advice is to not play it safe, to take that risk, to be courageous in conversations. And that's not an easy thing to do.
Max, where would you start?
Certainly I agree with the know yourself. I wish I knew myself a lot better when I was younger and confronted my own insecurities and difficulties. We've been talking about family of origin and the idea that you end up in the law, and I was in the law to help the underdog and to correct injustice, because I didn't feel like I got heard too well at home. That's what I think now, but if I'd have grown to that awareness earlier on as to why was I doing this, why did I want to be in an adversarial system? Because it gave me control and an opportunity to cross-examine people and feel good about it. So knowing myself at a lot earlier stage, self-awareness, undoubtedly self-awareness, and then training. We've talked around it, but I think we've all agreed that cradle to grave in conflict, and yet no training at any stage between cradle and grave unless you seek it out. And that was one of the motivations for this conference, is that it's time. We've got to address it. So I would start with those things, know yourself, and then training repeatedly and a lot of practice in the art of communication. Keep chipping off the green.
I think the fact that you asked the question is incredibly encouraging for people like me, because you're saying, what do I do to bring myself into this? The fact that you asked the question and that you're here is its own answer. I think we all come from very different places. And I was like you, John, I was at one stage a teacher, and I taught French and German and Latin. And when I discovered that really there were people that couldn't speak English, I thought maybe I should teach English as a second language, so I did. And then everything will be fine. And then when I realised there was still discrimination, I went to the discrimination board, and hence my career sort of went sideways towards the law, even though I'm not a lawyer. So I think that if we are searching for some of these things, they come to us. And I think that's really, it's the search that, I think we've probably got time for another question, if there's one more. Can we have a mic at the front?
He controls it.
Yep. I guess that notion of knowing yourself and the notion of the value of daily meditation and self-reflectiveness and self-reflection and self-awareness. But I think that's the starting point. But I think, and not that I've succeeded, but I think the notion is the further down that journey you get, the more you realise you're really just a part of the other, and really you're just looking at a reflection a lot of the time, and it's kind of that sort of in knowing yourself you then become one with the other, and that's kind of where you connect. It's kind of where you're all connecting, and I think that's kind of the sort of the magic that you're all displaying in the insight and the awareness you bring. So I think the self is the starting point, but it's certainly not the end of the journey. It's in the other that the journey ends.
What a wonderful note to end on. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Would you like to come up here and join us?
You will after lunch,
She
as a
is
matter of
after
fact. All right, shall we eat? I think it's time.
Eating.
Thank you for that